On Halloween night of 2011, in the sleepy Canadian city of Armstrong, British Columbia, 18-year-old Taylor Van Diest is full of nostalgic excitement. A recent graduate of the local Pleasant Valley High School in June of that same year, Taylor had spent the summer reflecting on the nature of growing up and the passage of time. She had also recently learned to drive, finishing her lessons and passing the relevant examinations, and was about to receive her Canadian novice driver end plates. So we can understand why she might be overwhelmed with anxieties about officially becoming an adult, something we all contemplate at some point in our youth. She and her friends had ceased trick-or-treating for the previous few years, instead opting for more mature pursuits. But that year in particular, it had hit them that it was something they might never be able to do as friends ever again. They reminisced of the costumes they used to wear, the huge candy hauls they used to bring home, and the general sense of excitement and mischief that was always in the air on those Halloween evenings. Then together, they decided on one last trick-or-treating hurrah, committing to donning some spooky costumes one final time, before they would doubtlessly be turned away by homeowners as far too old for such childish activity. During the previous year, Taylor had been enamored with the much-loved AMC drama The Walking Dead. Millions of North Americans had been tuning in, week out, to keep up with the terrifying stories of Rick Grimes and his fellow survivors, and Taylor was no different. So when it came to her choice of costume that year, like countless other trick-or-treaters, Taylor opted for the slightly derivative but highly effective choice of zombie. All it took was a little pale makeup, some fake blood, and an old, torn purple blouse. Then Taylor was ready to roll. She and her gang of trick-or-treating friends had agreed to congregate at one of their parents' houses before heading out into the night, and before she left for the short walk, Taylor called her friend to let her know she was on her way at about 5:45 p.m., intending to use the usual walking route down Pleasant Valley Road. Taylor's boyfriend at the time, a young man named Colton, was not attending that evening's trick-or-treating, but was still in touch with her regularly. Taylor had promised to split her night's candy haul with him, a move characteristically generous of a young woman who had a reputation for being fun-loving and kind. But when she reached the intersection of Colony Avenue, Taylor decided to use a quiet shortcut the many locals used which crossed some train tracks. Taylor and her friends continued to exchange texts with her during the 10 minutes or so that followed, but suddenly, Taylor stopped replying. This might not usually be any cause to raise the alarm, but Taylor was a prolific texter and was generally known to reply with near-perfect spelling within mere seconds, unless she was asleep. Taylor's friends immediately began to worry. The last message Taylor had sent was to her boyfriend Colton at around 6:02 p.m. It simply read, "being creeped." But Taylor had misspelled the word creeped with 2 R's and only 1 E in the middle, as if it was a rushed message from someone who was very, very frightened. It was only a short walk between their 2 houses, a journey that should have been quick and uncomplicated, but when Taylor failed to arrive and Colton shared the frightening final text with them, her friends assumed the worst. Maybe it was the sinister nature of the date in question. Maybe it was an extrasensory perception that something was wrong. Regardless, Taylor's friends raised the alarm and immediately began to search the route between their homes for any sign of her. Around 2 hours later, while searching near some train tracks that ran near their homes, Taylor's friends found a cell phone lying in the dirt. Wondering just who might have managed to lose such an expensive item, they picked it up and examined it. It was Taylor's. In a panic, they continued their search, calling Taylor's name over and over along the route they knew she would have taken. They stopped shouting out her name only at around 8:45 p.m. when they saw a crumpled body lying in a patch of grass about 10 feet away from the train tracks. Even in the dark October evening, they recognized the shape of their friend almost immediately, but were horrified at the grisly sight that greeted them upon closer inspection. Taylor was lying face down in the long grass, mumbling incoherently and struggling to breathe. There was a heavy discoloration around her neck, as well as burst blood vessels in her eyes from where someone had attempted to strangle her. But it was the wounds to her head that caused the most alarm. Taylor's skull had been almost entirely crushed with repeated blows from some blunt object. Her hair was matted with drying blood and cranial fluid. She also had cuts on her lips, a large gash on her forehead, and somehow had bruising on the inside of her mouth. Taylor also had a large bruise on her shoulder consistent with the kind of injuries someone might have if they're thrown to the ground and stomped on. She also had bruising on her arms and hands, along with 2 broken fingers, wounds that are common when a person attempts to defend themselves from a brutal and overpowering attacker. Her horrified companions struggled to discern where her zombie makeup ended and her true injuries began. Police had been notified of her disappearance long before her body was found, but now an ambulance crew rushed to arrive on scene, transporting Taylor to a nearby hospital for treatment. Taylor's mother, Marie, accompanied her in the ambulance, reportedly repeating to her bloodied daughter over and over again, "Fight it. You're going to make it. Taylor, survive." Paramedics managed to stabilize her condition while on the way to the Jubilee Hospital, 20 minutes south of the city of Vernon. There, ER doctor Michael Concannon fought to save her life, but found that her pupils were large and unresponsive, a common symptom of massive brain injury. A subsequent CAT scan confirmed that things were not looking good for young Taylor. Taylor was placed on an artificial breathing machine in the hopes that it might buy doctors more time to save her life, but by the next morning, their valiant efforts had proved to be in vain. Taylor died as a result of a hemorrhage owed to the massive blunt force trauma she'd suffered as a result of the violent attack she'd been subjected to. A subsequent forensic examination found that Taylor's fingernails had skin and blood tissues trapped under them, evidence that she had made a brave attempt at fighting off her attacker. Although she might have passed on as a result of the horrific wounds she had suffered, the attempts that she had made to save her own life, scratching and tearing at her mystery assailant's flesh, were about to contribute to bringing them to justice. Along with the substance trapped under them, her nails were clipped and bagged as evidence by a forensically trained nurse. With a sizable amount of DNA evidence collected, all the police had to do was conduct a thorough enough investigation. Once they'd bagged their man, the DNA evidence would do the rest and secure a lengthy conviction for whichever predatory monster committed such a heinous act of violence. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were hard at work with their investigation when Taylor's obituary was published on the Vernon Morning Star's website. Taylor had not yet decided on a career path, the obituary read, but doubtless she would have made us all proud, whatever she would have chosen. We can only imagine the raw grief the small community felt at such a sudden passing, compounded by the fact that her life had been taken away in such a cruel and callous attack. Taylor's funeral was held on the evening of November the 7th, 2011, at Hassan Memorial Arena. Her murder had rocked the small town she once called home, so there were many in attendance who wished to pay their respects. But there was more than just a sense of love and loss in the air that evening. Many people wondered just who exactly in their community was responsible for her death, if the person was known to one of their number, or even if they were actually present. The RCMP began their investigation by canvassing the houses surrounding the place where Taylor's body was found. They discovered that people actually had heard screaming around the time the attack was thought to have taken place. One woman in particular was checking on her Halloween decorations when she had heard 2 distinctly female screams coming from the direction of the train tracks. But tragically, the woman simply put the scream down to lively Halloween antics from local youths. One can only imagine how haunted this lady will have been during the revelation that what she was hearing was far more than just youthful exuberance, but the sounds of an actual murder taking place. The RCMP also released images of Taylor wearing her Halloween costume to the public, in hopes that somebody who recognized her might come forward with information regarding anyone who may have been acting suspicious in the same area. They also set up a roadblock near the site of the murder, stopping any cars that passed in order to question them and potentially collect a few witness statements. They then held a press conference on November 3rd, 2011, in order to update the local and national media on the progress of their investigation. Both Taylor's loved ones and the gathered press were both disappointed to hear that there was no suspects in the case, but the RCMP assured them that every lead available would be followed up so that they might deliver swift justice to those that demanded it. However, they did not release any details on the nature of the murder or Taylor's cause of death, the reason being that only a handful of people knew of such information, one of whom was the person responsible for Taylor's death. Clued into the fact that investigators might be hot on their tail, the murderer could flee the area or even the country and might never face justice for their dreadful crimes. However, some bizarre events hampered the investigative process. Canadian police actually received a letter, the author of which claimed to be Taylor's murderer. But there was little in the letter's contents that indicated that they had any intimate knowledge regarding the details of the crime, and it was dismissed as hoax correspondence. It is an absolute mystery to me as to why anyone would wish to claim responsibility for such a killing, and only evidences the fact that there are some truly sick and disturbed people in the world, and perhaps the most concerning thing is that these kinds of things happen far more than we'd care to believe. In the last week of November 2011, another RCMP press conference was held, one in which some shocking new information came to light. It was announced that, thanks to the DNA pulled from under Taylor's fingernails, a genetic profile had been put together of the person thought to be responsible for her death. Police confirmed that the perpetrator was male, and his DNA matched that which was taken from the investigation following an unsolved assault against a massage parlor escort in the same geographical area, which took place around 2005. The man's stored DNA had no name attached to it, their identity remained a mystery, but regardless, a pattern was starting to emerge, an image of a predator who targeted lone women in order to get indecent gratification. And given the nature of the crimes committed, there were likely dozens of unreported incidents that stem from this man's reckless and predacious behavior. However, there was something of a breakthrough, one that was thoroughly welcomed by Taylor's friends and family. Thanks to witness statements taken after the 2005 assault, police now had a rough physical description of the offender, and a sketch artist was asked to draw a composite image based on this information. He was apparently a Caucasian male, with a slightly darker skin tone than most Canadians, approximately 19 to 20 years of age in 2005, which would obviously make him 25 to 26 at the time of Taylor's murder. He had dark eyes, most likely brown, and had short, dark hair and thick eyebrows, with an estimated height of 5'8 to 5'10. He was also said to possess a rather stocky build, but was apparently not athletic or muscular. He was also believed to be native to the area, with intimate enough knowledge of the surrounding area to be able to make a quick escape once he realized Taylor was not the easy target he had expected her to be. Police also released a brief psychological profile, suspecting him to be quick to anger and highly emotionally unstable. After all, he had essentially thrown a temper tantrum when he couldn't get what he wanted, one that manifested itself incredibly violently. Since he couldn't have Taylor, no one would. In light of this, police appealed to the general public to come forward with any information regarding anyone who had experienced conflict or emotional pressure in the days before Halloween, including things like financial misfortune or trouble in a romantic relationship. They also asked anyone who had noticed a friend, relative, or neighbor show up with visible scratches on their face, neck, or arms to come forward for obvious reasons, or for information regarding anyone who made a sudden departure from the Armstrong area in the days following the attack. After the press conference, information poured in from almost 1,300 individuals who claimed to have pertinent information. Given that the population of the area surrounding Armstrong was about 10,000 people, that's a huge percentage of people that stepped up to try to help out with the investigation, speaking to the impact the murder had on such a close-knit community. And speaking of the impact the murder had, there was a pervasive sense of fear in Armstrong, given that the killer was basically still on the loose. In a community that spent rather a lot of time walking from place to place, foot traffic dropped off to almost nothing, and those that did walk places did so in groups. What was evident was that Taylor's murder was most certainly not the first time her killer had acted out, and it was more than likely that it was only a matter of time before he did so again. In December of 2011, The RCMP task force set up to investigate Taylor's murder traveled in force to Cherryville, British Columbia. There had been over 30 reports of a man residing there fitting the exact physical description they shared with the public during the last press conference, a man by the name of Matthew Stephen Forster. Not only did Forster fit the physical profile, but he was known to be somewhat erratic and over-emotional. On top of that, Forster had fled his rented apartment in a hurry just a few days after Taylor's murder. His landlord confirmed that Forster had asked for the damaged deposit back, but abandoned the request once he had learned that it would take a few days to get cashed, and left all of his belongings behind in the apartment. Forster's father later came and collected said belongings, and CCTV footage shows him acting extremely skittishly as he did so, almost as if he knew why his son had fled in such a hurry. Forster Sr. was later contacted by RCMP and questioned as to why his son had to leave the area so quickly. He replied that his son had secured a high-paying job at some oil field up in the north of the country, but had to leave quickly since the job offer was at extremely short notice. But Forster Sr.'s word wasn't taken as gospel by the police, since he himself had a criminal history that stretched all the way back to 1969, when he was arrested for stealing a car. There were other convictions for possession of controlled substances as well as escaping custody. Needless to say, Matthew Forster became the #1 suspect in Taylor's murder. Not only was his alibi proving to be somewhat shaky, but other evidence soon came to light that he was definitely worthy of investigation. A search warrant for the Forster's cell phone records dating back to Halloween was issued, and the cell carrier that he was a customer of provided the relevant information to the police. Unsurprisingly, cell tower records showed that he was indeed in the area of Pleasant Valley Road on the night of the murder. Although we have no idea how the RCMP managed to get hold of Forster's DNA material, an analysis showed that it was a dead match for the DNA found under Taylor's fingernails, as well as the DNA gleaned from the 2005 indecent assault. They had their man, but where exactly was he hiding? The key to that was his father. Forster Sr. was hiding something that was painfully obvious to RCMP investigators, but they never could have guessed how heavily he was involved in his son's attempt to avoid justice. Not long after Matthew Forster was named as the main suspect, a man came forward claiming that Matthew's father had paid $500 Canadian for a bunch of his personal IDs, obviously so that he could forge a fake identity for his murderous son, promising he would return the IDs after a few months. Police then commenced to tap Forster Sr.'s cell phone, only to discover that he was indeed in contact with his fugitive son and was working on obtaining yet another fraudulent identity for Matthew so that he might seal his escape from justice for good. In late March of 2012, police were listening into a phone call between Matthew and his father when they finally let slip about his current location. Matthew had managed to secure a fairly well-paying job at a glass factory in Collingwood, Ontario, using the fraudulent documents provided by his father. On the phone call in question, he even bragged about his new photo ID provided by his employer, boasting that it would only increase his chances of getting off scot-free for the murder of an innocent young woman. Ironically, it was this phone call that Forster Sr. advised his son to stop using the cell phone he had been provided, as he had a bad feeling their calls may be being tapped. Police knew this was the time to strike, moving in to arrest Matthew Forster on charges of first-degree murder. They also took Forster Sr. into custody on charges of aiding and abetting a wanted fugitive. It was while in custody that Forster Sr. boasted to another prisoner about how he tried to help his son escape justice. There was just one problem with that, though, as the prisoner in question happened to not be a prisoner at all, but an undercover cop. Matthew Forster was immediately extradited back to British Columbia after his arrest, so that he could be charged with the murder of Taylor Van Diest. His initial police interview went on for hours and hours until finally, in the face of overwhelming evidence of his guilt, he confessed to Taylor's murder. A homicide detective asked Forster to look him in the eye before asking, "Do you feel bad for killing Taylor?" "Yes," Forster simply replied. He went on to say that he felt sick about what he had done, and admitted to having some serious anger issues as well as problems with indecent desires. Forster continued his confessions by admitting that he had driven into Armstrong on the afternoon of October 31st with the intent to find a young woman to assault, and for this, his charge was upgraded from second-degree murder to first. According to his confession, after he found Taylor walking near the railroad tracks, he tried to stop and talk to her for a few minutes, but once he realized they were alone, pushed her to the ground and told her to keep quiet. When she didn't comply with his demands, Forster admitted that he just freaked out. But the fact that he admitted choking Taylor with a shoelace, one the prosecutors argue he had on him for the express purpose of tying someone up, showed a distinct premeditation to his actions. In March of 2014, Forster finally stood trial for the crimes he had committed. After a few weeks of harrowing testimony from Taylor's friends and family, Matthew Stephen Forster was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for at least 25 years. Taylor's mother and father told the courtroom that they would never have full closure when it came to their daughter's untimely passing, but were grateful that justice had finally been served. We're sad that we'll never be able to bring her back, but we're also happy that Animal is going to be off the streets, Taylor's mother told reporters at a press conference following the trial. Matthew's father also received a prison sentence for his part in aiding his son's attempts to escape justice, but with a sentence of just 3 years, some felt that he too had, to some degree, escaped justice. Since then, Halloween has become a night when Armstrong residents remember the bright shining light that Taylor Van Diest brought into the lives of all that knew her, a time when they try to forget the occasion when the scariest night of the year was made all the more terrifying by a dangerous and very real monster.
This is less of a creepy one-person encounter and more of a whole community creeped out by one man. The neighbor in question is somewhat famous for his lawn, an impossibly thick green landscape that he had tended by a company. I'm vaguely aware of him losing it on the landscapers, screaming at them outside. Enough I knew he had a temper. The first real red flag that he might be legit crazy came last summer. He asked a teenage boy in the neighborhood to check in on the house once a day and make sure all the doors and windows were secured and water their flowers. The day they left, though, he left a crazy list, saying the kid had to be there multiple times a day, turning off and on different sets of lights at specific times, and leaving weird chores for him. Also, the kid was not allowed to walk on the lawn, and he had to remove his dirty shoes before walking on the concrete sidewalk. He was never to enter the house, but was to turn off and on the lights from the doorway by means of a stick with a loop on it. Also, he was not allowed to use the garden hose to water the lawn, and had to instead use a teeny tiny watering can. The letter implied that my neighbor would have the kid under surveillance and would have pictures if he failed to comply. Basically, the kid's parents called him and said they weren't comfortable with the situation anymore, and while they would keep an eye on the house, the deal was off. They argued over the phone. When my neighbor got back from vacation, it was early morning, and he immediately went to their house, woke them, and tried to pick a fight with them. One of the other neighbors is a retired colonel and came out to see what was going on and tried to settle the issue. Crazy neighbor said that he would let it rest if he was allowed to bare-ass spank the kid. He flipped out when they told him hell no. Sometime after this, another neighbor was at the grocery store when he was concerned by Crazy Neighbor. Crazy Neighbor apparently just talked at him in rapid fire for a half hour. Among other things, he started saying how wives shouldn't have friends, and said that his wife's sister was so fat she broke the toilet seat last time she visited. After this, everyone started talking about how you don't see his wife anywhere. Occasionally she will be out watering flowers, but while her husband is seen out, she isn't. Considering that she used to be a social butterfly, this is weird. During the winter, everyone found pamphlets on their mailbox from the landscaper he uses, along with a note saying it was mandatory to now use this landscaper in our area, and failure to comply will result in being sued. We are private, single-family homes with no homeowners association, so this is patently untrue. During the winter, someone saw his wife and her arm was in a sling and she had a black eye. When they went to ask her about it, he wouldn't let her speak and said she had slid on ice. Since then, there have been a few attempts made to talk to her alone, and all have failed. They've gone so far as to get their church involved and to call a welfare check by the cops when he was out of the house. But if she is being abused, she has been refusing help. Snow was bad this year, and he blew a fit about the snowplows piling snow on his property. So he scattered screws on the roadway outside before they came one morning. Then someone in the neighborhood got a puppy. It's quiet and has a fenced-in backyard. Its owners wake up in the middle of the night to the doorbell ringing. When they come out, Crazy Neighbor is standing on the road at the edge of the property. He tells them that the first time the dog gets out, they won't have a dog anymore, and he pulls out a gun and waves it around before pointing it towards the backyard and saying, "Bang." Obviously, they go back inside and call the cops. When confronted, Crazy Neighbor claims he was out for a walk, thought they were awake and stopped by. He says he didn't get the gun out, but it had been on his belt, and that he didn't mean his statement as a threat. He ended up getting some sort of citation from the police. Come spring, he is taken to sitting outside and writing something every time someone walks or drives by. We don't know what, but I have taken to driving differently home to avoid going by him. Most recently, someone put up a swing set in their backyard. They came back from work to find tire tracks through the backyard and the swing set run over and crushed. No one saw anything, but his massive truck happens to have the same kind of tires as the tread arcs left behind. The retired colonel has taken to compiling statements from everyone and keeping records, because we think this is going to end badly.
I recently moved into a new apartment. It's a fairly old building, but the rent is cheap, and it's got its own gym, so me and my roommates were easily sold on the place. We live in the corner apartment, so we only have 2 neighbors. One is a fairly old man, his partner, and their dog. They're pretty nice. The other neighbor, I only met a week ago. I originally heard about her from her boyfriend. One morning, on Monday, as I head out to the elevator to go to work, I'm asked to hold it by a guy running down the hall. I let him on, and we start the ride down. He asks if I'm new and if I like the place so far. I say yes, and give small answers. Still half asleep, clutching my coffee thermos. The guy laughs and says, "You look just like my girlfriend, Amy. She's barely coherent until she gets her first cup of coffee." I laugh weakly, my still sleepy brain a little annoyed. Yeah, I'm not a morning person. It's clear that this guy is head over heels for Amy, and is a morning person. The 2-minute trek to the street outside our apartment is his excitable gabber about Amy. And apparently, he's planning something big for this weekend. He wants to do something nice for her birthday. We part ways at the street, and I don't see him again. A couple of days later, I'm heading home from work. I just get into our elevator when a girl bursts in behind me. She's in her mid-20s and looks kind of frazzled. I tug my headphones out and ask, "Hey, are you okay?" "Oh, yeah, I'm just..." She stares at the entrance of our building until the doors to the elevator close. I'm getting a bad feeling. What's up with her? She looks scared out of her mind. I asked what floor she would like, and if she's okay again. And the girl shakily replies floor 7, my floor, and that she is fine. We get out together, and I realize that she is in fact my other neighbor. Trying to seem friendly, since she has clearly had some sort of horrible day, I say, "Oh, I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself sooner. My name is Alice. I live right next door." She shakes my hand, having calmed down some now. "I'm Amy." I smile. "Well, have a good night, and tell your boyfriend I said hi, okay?" My stomach twists as I see what little color has been returned to Amy's face drain away. I don't have a boyfriend. Trying to fish for some realistic explanation in my head, I press on with it. Your roommate then. Sorry, I didn't mean to assume. Amy shakes her head. I live alone. Who told you that they were my boyfriend? I explained the meeting with the elevator guy a couple days prior. Amy, now looking sick, hurriedly explains the situation and insists I go file a police report with her then and there. This man, whose name I learn is Dan, has been stalking Amy for over 3 months. He's her ex-boyfriend, and things ended very badly for them. She's been trying to get a restraining order since he's shown up at her work regularly, been making phone calls, and now apparently has figured out where she lives. I explained Dan's plans to do something special for Amy that weekend to the police. We asked if there was any way someone could watch the complex for her that night. This request goes nowhere, and a restraining order can't be taken up yet. And apparently, not enough evidence, and she has never been harmed by Dan. We head back to the apartment. Amy thanks me and says she plans to spend the night and the rest of the week at a friend's house, just in case Dan tries something now that we know he's in the building. Thankfully, nothing happened, and I never saw Dan again. But Amy packed her things and moved out the following week. So Dan the stalker. Let's not meet again.
So yesterday I was at my sister's house with my mom, watching my son and nephews play in the yard. One of my nephews, Harrison, was picking bark off a tree when I remembered an odd encounter I had as a kid. I said, "So weird," out loud, thinking about the encounter. My mom inquired what I was talking about, so I told her. When I was a kid, I was hanging out at the Pinecone Forest, which was what the neighborhood kids called a small patch of trees on the side of the road. I was picking bark off one of the trees to pass the time, waiting for my friend Frankie to finish his homework and come out to play. Out of nowhere, it seemed, a guy came up to me. I could smell him before I saw him. He smelled like stale cigarette smoke. I was kind of scared when I looked at him. He wasn't very old, but he had a very lazy eye that was cloudy, and his teeth and fingernails were stained yellow. My mom taught me to be nice to people, even if they don't look like me, so I faked a smile and said hello. "What are you doing?" he asked me. The smell of his breath was the worst. I'm picking the bark off this tree." "You shouldn't do that. It's like picking off the tree's skin. How would you feel if someone picked off your skin?" he said while lightly pinching my arm with his sharp yellow nails. I don't know," I replied and took my arm back. Just then Frankie's mom called for me out the door and told me to come in and wait inside. I didn't think anything of the whole thing at the time. When I told my mom about it, she had this look of, I don't know, guilt maybe. She said that it's probably time I know the whole story. She thought I forgot about the whole encounter, so she never brought it up to me. First, you should know that the neighborhood I grew up in was a small, tight-knit community. Everyone knew everyone, and there was no reason for an outsider to come unless they knew someone there. Anyway, here's what happened with this guy. Frankie's mom, Sonia, noticed a white van with no windows parked on the side of the road. How cliché, right? She didn't recognize it, but figured maybe it was a visitor for a neighbor. Sonia said, or rather told the police, that the van had been there all morning and afternoon. She was kind of keeping an eye on it. She said she just had a bad feeling. Her house had a huge window in the front facing the pinecone forest, and the van was parked next to it. She saw me waiting for Frankie and kept a constant eye on the van while holding the phone just in case. She saw the man exit the back of the van and walk up to me. As soon as she saw him grab my arm and pinch me, she called the cops. That was when she called me into her house. The cops stopped the guy just outside of my neighborhood. In the back of his van were binoculars, a Polaroid camera, and pictures of me taped all over the walls and ceiling. Me at school, at my grandparents' house, at the bank with my mom. Just me, everywhere I went. But that's not all. He had a key to a storage unit on him. Inside the unit they found a cabinet full of knives. A lot of knives. Paring knives, a butcher cleaver, a thin flay knife, a melon baller, and just various knives of all shapes and sizes. There was also a few anatomy books, obstetrical equipment, duct tape, and 10 empty 5-gallon buckets. In the middle of the unit was an old bed that was used to restrain mental patients, so it had wrist and ankle straps, and the entire inside of the unit was covered in plastic wrap. My mom said he was in a high-security mental institution for the criminally insane, last she heard. So it's pretty clear he had plans for me.
So this is my first post here. I hope this is a good fit. I lurked and read a lot of creepy encounters here. So often people will mention how they give off a creeper vibe. It would be nice if they all did, because this guy didn't. So for background, this guy, we'll call him Pete, is the brother of one of my neighbors. I'm 34, he's around my age, and my daughter is 8 and plays with the neighbor's kids sometimes. Neighbors are relatively normal people. Yeah, they party a bit, but so do I. Pete seemed as normal as anyone. He didn't have the creeper vibe at all. No sweatpants and tank top with random stains. He didn't drive a creepy van, never made any inappropriate comments. In fact, he kept a neat goatee and was quite well dressed. And the few times I've met him, we drank and smoked together, and he just seemed like an all-around decent guy. And then one day, the cops are there. They take Pete away in cuffs, and he doesn't live there. But I guess they had a warrant and knew him to visit there, so that's where they got him. Now I figured it was probably no big deal. Maybe a drug charge, or outstanding warrants for some petty stuff. Now I don't ask, because it hardly seems polite to say, "Hey, what did your brother get arrested for?" But it's public record, and I know his name, so of course I checked. And the charge was about as bad as it could possibly be. Child rape. Victim under the age of 13. What in the actual fuck? He didn't seem like that type at all. And I guess that's what really creeps me out. Sick, twisted pedophiles that could easily be mistaken for a normal person. As the father of a young girl, that scares me more than anything else. The creeper vibe just wasn't there. Anyway, he was convicted and will die in prison. So, seemingly normal super creep kitty diddler, let's never meet again. We won't, and more importantly, no other child will ever meet you again either.
My husband and I live in an apartment complex in a kind of crappy neighborhood. Low-income homes, what have you. There are always lots of break-ins, and it's right next to kind of the downtown area of my city. It was mid-April of last year, and I was about 7 months pregnant, and my husband and I would often go out on our balcony late at night. Really just the outdoor catwalks of the apartments, which connected to the outdoor stairwells and hallways. so it was either very late or very early depending on your point of view, and it was quite dark, and my husband and I were standing outside looking at the moon over the tops of the apartments. He was smoking, and I was unable to sleep due to back pain, the joys of pregnancy. We were chatting about whatever, and suddenly, in the dark before us from the first floor, we heard someone talking. It startled us both, and my husband cocked his head and made a shushing gesture as we both froze. A man's voice, low, was whispering something from the first floor directly below us. I had chills. I couldn't quite hear what he was saying, but it was only his voice, and he sounded like he was having a conversation with himself. As we stood there, both straining to hear him, his voice seemed to be moving away from us. Then we heard the distinct sound of someone shuffling up the stairs. He was climbing the steps to the second floor, slow and deliberately, still muttering. My husband instinctively moved toward me and put out his cigarette as the man rounded the corner onto the outside landing we stood on. He was maybe 35 or 40, but he looked aged in a way I can't really describe. His hair was prematurely gray. He looked really tired at first glance because of his body language, but his eyes were frantic. My husband later told me that he seemed to be high on meth. My husband wasn't a very good kid 15 years ago and had experience with certain drugs. He was also, unexpectedly, walking a dog, a very pretty blue heeler. He walked right towards us, and my husband stepped in front of me protectively. The dog stopped suddenly, and so did the man, as if he had somehow just noticed us. He visibly jumped, then laughed.
Hello? Oh gosh, I didn't even see you there. Pardon me, just walking my little girl.
He had the very definition of crazy eyes. They jumped all over the place, and when they landed on me, they jumped immediately to my big belly in an almost angry way.
Oh, pregnant.
What? I said, sounding like a jerk even to myself.
You're pregnant? Yeah? My wife, well, ex-wife, she used to be a doula. Used to do those things. Used to help out ladies and deliver them, yeah. Babies are great. I have 2 babies. Well, my wife has them. Well, ex-wife, I guess, yeah.
It's hard to really convey how he was talking. He sounded really excited, but also weirdly desperate. You could tell maybe he wanted someone to talk to. Now I should mention that I'm a filthy bleeding heart, and my husband is a take no shit, look out for number 1 kind of guy. He cuts the guy off mid-ramble and says, "We were just going inside, man. You have a good night."
Sure, I'm sorry. I'm Mike, by the way. I'm Mike. Mike.
He sticks his hand out, and I shake it. His hands are soaking wet. I almost immediately yank my hand back, and he doesn't even notice. He's taking the dog leash and twisting it weirdly. Every muscle inside of my body is screaming for me to get away from this man. Instead, I tell him my name. At this point, my husband grabs my arm and yanks me towards our apartment, past Mike and the pretty dog. I waddle to the door, and as I open it, look back. Mike is watching me very intently. Once we get inside, we lock the door and talk about him. My husband is insisting he was on meth. He also mentions that it's weird that he's walking his dog upstairs at 3 a.m. when we knew he didn't live in our building. I wrote the guy off as a creepy drug addict, brought our shotgun into the bedroom, and fell asleep. 3 nights later, we are outside again. The building across the street from us is another apartment building, and moments after we walk outside, Mike comes out, staring right at us, walking his dog. He is smiling weird. He's headed for the stairs. We wave and go inside and lock the door again. 2 days after that, I'm getting out of my car at around 4 p.m. and he appears, pretty much at my trunk. 1 second I was grabbing my stuff to get up, and the next second he was standing there. There was no dog this time. He engages me in this weird conversation about how he knows my little girl is gonna be beautiful, just like me, and how lucky I am, how I should never ever get divorced because it ruins people's lives. I can tell he is extremely depressed. He says his daughter and wife left him only a few months ago. My husband yells for me from the balcony, and I make a lame excuse and leave Mike to his weird, jittery self. Husband interrogated me on what I said and warned me to just stay away from him. That night, there's a knock at my door. I check my phone, and it's 3:30 a.m. I have a lot of stupid neighbors that like to get wasted, so I decide to wait and see if they knock again. They do, this time more urgently. Feeling hot, fat, pregnant and tired, I poke my husband with my foot and tell him someone is at the door. He continues snoring loudly. I resigned myself to getting out of bed. I threw on a robe and trotted out to the front door. Just before I unlock it, I froze. Something told me to check my peephole. An unexplained feeling of dread washed over me. Slowly, I peeked through. At first, I didn't even know what I was looking at. I squinted and tried to focus my vision. Something didn't look right. It didn't look like the hallway. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The realization that I was staring directly into Mike's eye hit me, and I swear it felt like liquid ice in my veins. My stomach was in my feet, my breath caught, my hands immediately started pouring sweat. I jumped back from the door and started stumbling backwards. I backed into a wall and hit my head. I tried to catch my breath. Mike knocked again and called my name, softly, like he didn't want to wake anyone, like he knew I was there. He probably did. Looking into the opposite side of a peephole will show no clear images, but will show shadows. I turned around and ran into my bedroom, shut the door, and shook my husband awake. He sat bolt upright and grabbed his shotgun, told me to stay in bed. I heard him tell Mike to leave or he was going to call the police, and then silence. Within a minute, my husband came back into the room and said he was gone, that if I heard anything else to wake him up. I agreed and didn't sleep anymore that night. Several weeks passed before we heard from him. In fact, we'd all but forgotten about him until our car got broken into. The cops showed up to collect evidence, and we told them about Mike, about his creepy behavior and how we suspected him of doing it. They seemed confused until we mentioned his dog, and then the officer paled. He asked for a full description of what Mike had done. He wanted a statement. Mike got picked up 2 nights after the peephole incident for aggravated sexual assault on a pregnant woman in her own home, 2 buildings down from us. He had extremely bad PTSD from his time in the Corps and was also a meth abuser, just as the husband had predicted. So, I'm so glad that I checked that stupid peephole.
Early on Halloween morning of 1981, Sister Tadea Benz was asleep in her bedroom at the St. Francis Convent in Amarillo, Texas. The 76-year-old nun had resided at the convent for most of her life, and it had been many, many years since the sister made a permanent commitment to God by pronouncing perpetual vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. On an average morning, Sister Tadea would awake at 5 a.m. sharp, fetch herself some coffee, and then visit with the convent's cat, Chloe. At 6:30, she would then walk down on the on-site chapel to attend morning prayer according to the Liturgy of the Hours, which was one of Sister Tadea's most favorite prayers. She believed that although they were divided by continents and time zones, the structure provided by the Liturgy of the Hours was something that helped nuns of all different cultures feel part of the wider network of faith. But on the morning of October 31st, Sister Angela Martinez, one of Sister Tadea's closest friends, noticed that she was not in attendance. This was obviously unusual. Despite her advanced age, Tadea never failed to miss a single morning service. "I missed her and was concerned because she seldom missed chapel," Sister Angela later said. So at around 7:30 a.m., as soon as morning service had finished, a handful of nuns gathered together and walked over to Sister Tadea's bedroom in order to check up on her. When they arrived, they found that the door to Sister Tadea's convent room was closed. "It was very much unusual to see that door was closed," Sister Angela added, because Tadea was hard of hearing and always left her door ajar to hear the morning buzzer. But when they opened the door, they were completely unprepared for what they found. On the floor of her bedroom, Sister Tadea lay nude and alone, with her arms outstretched by her sides and clotting blood surrounding her uncovered head. One of the nuns rushed over to revive her, but her body was cold. They checked her pulse, but there was none. Sister Tadea Benz was dead. To all observers, it appeared that Tadea had risen at her usual time, only to take a nasty fall which resulted in a traumatic head injury. It was heartbreakingly unexpected. The sister had not appeared unwell or weak in the days prior to her death, but the sisters took her passing in their stride. Tadea had led a good life and had dedicated herself to Christ. They had no doubt that she now resided in heaven at God's right hand. Sister Angela was in complete shock. The grief was almost overwhelming, and she could not bring herself to be around her late friend's body any further. So she enlisted the help of 4 other nuns who promptly went about wrapping Sister Tadea in a sheet before diligently cleaning up the spots of blood from the otherwise pristine bedroom floor. Once the work was completed, the nuns simply left their deceased sister in peace and went about planning her funeral arrangements. But later in the day, a Sister Florentine expressed her desire to visit Tadea's bedroom, where her body still lay, in order to pay her final respects to her departed sister. And it was while sitting near the body, praying that her soul would be lovingly received by the God she had incessantly worshipped for most of her adult life, that Florentine noticed something that would come to cause shockwaves among the pious community of the St. Francis Convent. One of Tadea's bedroom windows had been broken. How this went unnoticed by the previous visitors of the room is something of a mystery, but there is every chance that since the nuns were so absorbed by their sister's passing and the morbid sight that greeted their entry, that they simply failed to observe such an unusual detail. Whatever the reason, the decision was made to call the police and inform them of a potential break-in. When deputies from the Amarillo Sheriff's Department arrived at the convent, Sister Tadea's body had been removed from her bedroom and driven to a local funeral home, so their investigation focused solely on the possibility of a break-in. It was only when one of the deputies overheard a conversation among the nuns regarding Tadea's passing that they became aware that a death had occurred. Eager to rule out foul play, a deputy asked to briefly examine her body and quickly discovered bruising around the dead nun's neck. Sister Florentine, like the other nuns who discovered her lifeless body, had taken it for granted that Tadea had died a natural death, and the revelation that she had in fact been murdered caused an outpouring of shock and horror among the convent's occupants. But the truth surrounding her death would only become more horrifying after sheriff's deputies transported Sister Tadea's body to a nearby mortician for further examination. A nun being strangled to death in the middle of the night was appalling and disturbing on its own, but the coroner who performed the post-mortem on Tadea's corpse discovered something even more atrocious. Before her life had been snuffed out by what would have to be someone of unspeakable evil, she had been indecently assaulted. Sister Tadea's bedroom was officially declared a crime scene, and forensic investigators were called in to gather evidence. They gathered up Tadea's bed linens and night clothes to analyze them for bodily fluids, and it was during this process that police discovered a large steak knife that had been hidden under her bed. This had been used to cut away the screen on her window, but it was confirmed that the cause of death were not stab wounds or loss of blood, but asphyxiation by manual strangulation. Police were able to lift fingerprints from the handle of the knife, as well as from the bed's headboard, which had apparently been used for leverage by the murderer as he assaulted the 76-year-old nun as she slept. When deputies moved in to question those who lived in the homes neighboring the convent, they discovered that one or two of the residents who happened to be awake in the wee small hours of October 31st had seen a youngish-looking man running away from the convent. The reports of the murderer being somewhat young were corroborated when fingerprint analysis brought back a match, that of a 17-year-old boy named Johnny Frank Garrett, who was already known to Amarillo's Sheriff's Department given he had previously been a suspect in a burglary case. Garrett initially denied all charges, but the evidence against him was almost overwhelming. It was gathered by a unit that combined deputies from Potter and Randall counties, as well as Amarillo police. It was the first multi-agency cooperative law enforcement investigation in the history of Amarillo and led to the creation of a flagship special crimes unit. It was discovered that Garrett's fingerprints were a match to those found at the crime scene. Amarillo Police Sergeant Claude Stevens testified that fingerprints found in the room of the slain nun could, quote-unquote, not have been made by any other person than Garrett. Hairs taken from Sister Tadea's bed linens were determined to have the same individual characteristics as Garrett's. Not only that, but the steak knife found under the nun's bed was of the same manufacturer, design, and make as another steak knife recovered from Garrett's home address. However, Garrett countered that he had not been at the convent in the early hours of Halloween, but had in fact broken in a few days previously with the intention of stealing valuables. He told police that he had entered the convent, not via Tadea's bedroom window, but via the front door at around noon. His route took him from the medication room to the cafeteria, which is where he claimed to have picked up the knife. Garrett then claimed that he snuck into several of the bedrooms, one of which was Sister Tadea's, which is where he found her sleeping. He said his fingerprints on the headboard of her bed could be explained by the fact that he used it to lean on whilst reaching across her bed to take an expensive-looking cross which was mounted on the wall. After he'd received the cross, he'd heard a noise at the convent, then simply fled, seeking refuge from the law in his mother's house at around 10 p.m. on October 30th, where he insisted he had remained until the following morning. At Garrett's trial for Sister Tadea's murder, one of the other nuns who resided at the St. Francis convent testified that his story was impossible. A Sister Bernice Nogler asserted that there was no way Garrett would have been able to enter the convent through its front door, since it was kept locked and only open for scheduled visitors. Not only that, but given that noontime was one of the cafeteria's busiest times of the day, there was absolutely no way that Garrett could have entered unnoticed, let alone be able to steal a steak knife undetected. She also added that Garrett's claim of bending a knife whilst prying open a locked drawer was complete nonsense. He broke into a convent, a place where theft was considered a grave sin, so there was no need for any nun to lock away her belongings, nor did they have anything to hide from each other. Sister Bernice also added that the suggestion of Sister Tadea owning any kind of valuable, gold-plated cross was utterly ridiculous. She had taken a vow of poverty, an essential part of becoming a bride of Christ, and actively eschewed such pointless trinkets in favor of true wealth, God's love. The state prosecutor also called several eyewitnesses who lived in the same neighborhood as Garrett's mother, one of whom said that they had seen Garrett stalking around the property of an elderly neighbor of theirs during a few hours before the time when Sister Tadea was murdered. Another neighbor testified that he had seen Garrett on his own property at around 11 p.m. on the 30th of October, again, just a few hours before Tadea's life was violently snuffed out. A look into Garrett's personal history provides many clues as to why he might commit an act of such pure evil. One of the psychologists who interviewed him pending his trial confirmed that he was severely mentally impaired, describing him as chronically psychotic and as having one of the most virulent histories of abuse and neglect I have ever encountered in 28 years of practice. When he was just a boy, Garrett was repeatedly assaulted by his stepfather, who also loaned him out to other child abusers to be used for their gratification. From the age of 14 onwards, he was forced to perform bizarre acts and even made to participate in the recording of certain films in which he starred with much older men. At the age of just 10 years old, he was introduced to drugs and alcohol by members of his own family and subsequently developed severe substance abuse problems, which culminated in heavy use of brain-damaging substances such as paint thinner and amphetamines. Garrett was also regularly physically abused, and on one occasion was picked up and sat upon the burner of a stove, resulting in hideous, permanent scarring to his backside and thighs. The severe physical abuse resulted in some pretty serious head injuries and brain damage, resulting in some shockingly paranoid delusions, including the belief that the lethal injection, Texas's preferred method of execution at the time, would not actually kill him. Despite such a psychological profile, that information was not shared with the jury at his trial, who were only presented with the relevant physical evidence and witness testimonies. Garrett's trial ended in September of 1982 when a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, and the presiding judge found no difficulty in sentencing him to death. For the next 10 years of his life, Garrett was held at Ellis Unit, north of Huntsville, Texas, which at the time held men on the state of Texas's death row. He led a miserable existence, portrayed as an absolute monster by the media, despite his insistence that he was innocent of the crime he was convicted of. The date of his execution was set to be the 6th of January 1992, but just before he was scheduled for the lethal injection, there came an unlikely intervention from someone that caused something of a media frenzy around the world. An appeal for clemency came in from none other than the head of the Catholic Church, Pope John Paul II. The Pope contacted the governor of Texas at the time, a woman by the name of Ann Richards, with a deeply convincing argument for mercy. It was in his opinion that not only was it in the interest of the Catholic Church to forgive Garrett for his crimes, but it was also against Christ's teachings to take the lives of any living person, especially as a kind of revenge for a crime, wrath being one of the deadly sins. The Pope also argued that there was a considerable amount of information coming to light which suggested that Garrett was actually innocent of the crime he was accused of, and that his pleas were not just those of a guilty man afraid of his own death. In light of the phone call she received, as well as a letter campaign initiated by Catholics around the world, Governor Richards relented and granted Garrett a temporary reprieve. After Governor Richards' reprieve, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles communed to hold a hearing on whether or not Garrett should receive a commutation to merely life in prison instead of death. The 17 board members held a simple vote. When the votes were counted, it was found that not a single one of them had chosen to commute Garrett's sentence. All 17 believed he was guilty and should be executed for murdering Sister Tadea. And so, as a result of the failed vote for mercy, Johnny Frank Garrett was finally executed by lethal injection on February the 11th, 1992, at the age of 28. Local and national news sources discovered that his final meal request was ice cream, nothing more, and that he had declined to make a formal final statement regarding the murder or his supposed innocence. However, APB News claimed they had a source that was present inside the execution chamber when Garrett was let in, one who insisted that he had spontaneously said, "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me. The rest of the world can kiss it." The indecent assault and murder of a woman of God is perhaps one of the most obscene and disturbing crimes we can possibly encounter. But what is most disturbing about the case of Johnny Frank Garrett is that he might actually have been innocent of the crime, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. 22 years after jurors convicted him, and 12 years after Garrett was executed for the slaying, an Amarillo attorney attempted to prove his innocence. No reasonable mind would believe otherwise, Jesse Quackenbush said. The old and newly discovered evidence of Johnny Frank Garrett's innocence is so compelling, it will cause even the most bloodthirsty proponents of the death penalty to shake their heads in doubt. Quackenbush noted in a letter to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles that there were links between Sister Tadea's slaying and that of 77-year-old Narnie Box Bryson, who was killed just 3 months before Sister Tadea in the same part of town and in a very similar manner. The similarities were so striking that the district attorney at the time was convinced the same man killed both women. A man by the name of Leoncio Perez Rueda remains in jail in Bryson's slaying, and Quackenbush was quick to point out that during a recent interview, Rueda described assaulting and beating a nun on Halloween night in 1981. But given the finality of the death penalty, we might never find out the truth behind Sister Tadea's slaying, and we can only assume that given the mountain of evidence against Garrett, that he was in fact guilty of the crime. But still begs the question, which is more horrifying, the murder of a nun, or the fact that we may never get to know what really happened that night? What's clear is that the only two people who really know are the poor nun that was murdered, and the vicious, predatory monster that took her life. Hey everyone. Before the video begins, I just wanted to make you aware of a GoFundMe, linked down below, for some dear friends of mine who are one of many lives completely upended by Hurricane Helene. These friends had their home flooded last year during Hurricane Idalia and were displaced for nearly a year while they wrangled with insurance, FEMA, and contractors to just now, a year later, get their lives back to normal, only to a few weeks after have their entire home destroyed again by 5 feet of flooding within the space of 12 hours. Now, with all that being said, don't feel obligated to donate. I'm just hoping that we as a community can give them enough leeway financially as they go through the recovery process and decide how to approach this incredibly uncertain time in their lives. Thank you. On Halloween night, back in 1978, I was just 10 years old and I was getting ready to go trick-or-treating with my buddies from 5th grade. I remember being really excited because the year before, my friends and I had gotten to run up and down the streets in total freedom, knocking on houses wherever we could. Now, it sounds crazy to think that we were allowed to go out at night at that age, almost totally unsupervised, but since we were going from door to door and being constantly greeted by adults giving us candy, I guess folks figured that it was just safe as could be. And it really was. We had the night to ourselves, running around like crazy and seeing all our elementary school friends in their costumes. Then, at one point, there was this big old candy swap going on, where kids would swap their pixie sticks for Dum-Dums and their Tootsie Rolls for peanut butter cups, like some big old candy stock exchange. It was magical. One of those childhood memories you carry with you for the rest of your life, and most importantly, nothing very untoward happened. And so, as you can imagine, I was incredibly excited to do the whole thing again next year, and then incredibly disappointed when I found out it wasn't happening. The first year, so back in 77, I remember my parents saying something like, "Just make sure you're back before dark and don't go too far." But then the next year, in 78, my mom seemed way over-involved right from the get-go. She wanted to know who I'm going out with, where they live, what their parents' names were, and if I know their phone numbers and all of that. She asked me a million questions to the point where it got very annoying, and then when I told her that I was heading out to meet my friends, she broke some very bad news. I wouldn't be leaving on my own, and I wouldn't be trick-or-treating with my 5th grade buddies. I'd be waiting for our neighbor, Mrs. Anderson, to stop by with a bunch of random neighborhood kids, and she was going to walk us up and down the block for like half an hour before dropping us off back home. And believe me when I say, I was devastated. I kept asking why, what had changed, and why I couldn't go out with my friends. But all my mom would tell me was that if I didn't want to go with Mrs. Anderson, then I wasn't going trick-or-treating at all. I don't know if every kid's mom waited until the last goddamn moment to ruin their Halloween, but mine did, and I was on the verge of full-blown tears before I finally gave in. I was either going to suck it up or miss out on a big bag of candy and time with my friends, so obviously I chose the candy. I remember finishing off my cowboy costume in a real stinker of a mood, then when Mrs. Anderson showed up to collect me, off I went. It was me, Mrs. Anderson, and 3 other random kids from the neighborhood, one of which was Mrs. Anderson's kid, Billy. And at first I was still in a very terrible mood because I wasn't with my friends. We were under strict supervision, and Mrs. Anderson said that we could only walk in a short loop up and down the street. All the other kids were in chaperone groups like that too, so it wasn't like it was just us, and although it wasn't as lame as I thought it was going to be, it still sucked compared to the chaos of the previous year. So, we're maybe 20 minutes into the adult-mandated trick-or-treating, and the adults have this thing organized so badly that there's congestion toward the end of the route. We're literally queuing at this one house in front of not one, but 2 other groups of trick-or-treaters, and as Mrs. Anderson and the lady in front start talking to each other, her son sort of sidles up to me, points off into the distance and says, "That kid's giving me the creeps." I look to see what he's pointing at, and off in the distance, there's a kid standing near the edge of the park where the old jungle gym was. He was close enough for us to see that he was wearing a mask, but he's not with any kind of group. And so we say, "Hey, what gives? That kid gets to walk around on his own, why not us?" Looking back on it, it was kind of cold of us to just drop him like that, but we were kids. We didn't know any better. We saw perceived injustice and we called it out. Even chimps and monkeys go crazy when they think something is unfair. Anyway, we start yelling about this kid out there alone, and Mrs. Anderson sees him too, so she starts saying something like, "Hey, come back here right this instant, young man. You have to stay with your group." The kid just kind of stands there for a minute, not responding. And then Mrs. Anderson yells at him again, and he starts walking over to the groups of kids. Mrs. Anderson then says, "Which group are you with?" And then starts asking all around to the adults something like, "Was this kid with you?" But none of the adults seemed to recognize his mask, so each just sort of shook their heads when confused in the chaos. I remember looking at the kid and thinking how I was 99% sure that I hadn't seen him around that night. I'd been checking out everyone else's costumes and whatnot, and I didn't remember this kid's green goblin mask anywhere. Also, it wasn't a green goblin mask like the villain from Spider-Man. It was just sort of a goblin that happened to be green. Maybe that inspired Spider-Man, I don't know. Now anyways, I'm looking at the kid's mask thinking, I don't remember seeing him around. But at the same time, something about him was just oddly familiar to me. I don't know if it was his shoes or his clothes or the way he carried himself, but I'm pretty sure that I knew that kid from school. It turns out that I was 100% right on that one, but we'll get back to that later. So Mrs. Anderson is calling around towards all the other grown-ups asking if they're missing a kid, but I'm still watching the kid and trying to figure out why he seems so familiar. So Anderson isn't watching him, but I am. And that meant that I was still watching him when he slips away from Mrs. Anderson, walks right up to a kid in the group behind us that had just joined the line, and then pulls out a knife out of that candy bag that he had with him and just starts stabbing. Things were calm one minute and chaos the next, and all I remember is running back to my house because I was only a block away. My dad came to the door, and as I ran inside, he ran outside because he could hear 50 kids all screaming and running with adults trying to corral them. I mean, it must look like a freaking disaster movie or something, because some kids got blood on them, some of the adults had blood on them too. Just wild stuff for him to run out into with no context whatsoever. And I spent the rest of the night in my bedroom, scared out of my mind with my mom, making sure that I wasn't freaking out too hard, and the rest of this I got from my dad, so it's kind of secondhand info. I obviously saw the first stabbing happen up close, and in my head, I was thinking way more kids got hurt, maybe got killed too. But by some sheer miracle, no one died, and only one kid and one grown-up had to be taken to the hospital. And the grown-up only got hurt because they cut their hand on the knife while grabbing it off of the kid in the goblin mask who was doing the stabbing. It seems like we kind of dodged a bullet, right? That it could have been way worse? Well, it was way worse. And even now, no one really knows any of what that kid says is true or not. It's became an enduring urban legend in the town that I grew up in, though. And so the way it happened was that the kid started stabbing, and then some grown-up with brass balls ran up and immediately subdued the kid before he could hurt anyone else. The kid who got hurt received only defensive wounds, as in cuts to their hand, wrists from trying to defend themselves, you know. But then, the cuts were only minor, and it was like the kid was only trying to scare her, not really hurt her, but it just got out of control. That kind of fell in line with the kid's story, but like with that other thing about recognizing him, I'll get to that later. And so, this courageous grown-up pins the kid down, grabs the knife off of him, cutting themselves in the process, and like some Christopher Nolan version of Scooby-Doo, they pull the mask off the kid to reveal who the mysterious villain truly is, only to discover that it was a kid named Leroy. Leroy wasn't this kid's real name, obviously, but I don't think it's my place to be spreading him or his family name around the internet over something he did when he was 12 or however old he was. But he sure as hell looked like a Leroy, so I guess that's what I'll call him. Anyway, this Leroy kid came from a very bad family. Mom was on drugs, didn't take care of him properly, and Dad was never around. It's a real sad story and not Leroy's fault at all, but he ended up with a reputation as being like the school stinky kid. But then, almost totally unbeknownst to us kids, Leroy's appearance at the trick-or-treating event surprised everyone, and not just because he pulled out a knife, but because by that point, Leroy had been an official missing person for almost 2 months. So at the start of the school year, Leroy didn't show up to school. The school's principal then reached out to the county sheriff, who drove out to Leroy's family trailer to talk to his mom or her boyfriend. And both were high out of their minds, thought Leroy was at school, and raised all hell when the sheriff and his boys took them away in cuffs for child neglect. They had no idea Leroy was missing, but word has it that his mom bawled her eyes out down at the department, and I guess whenever she sobered up, it hit her what a terrible mom she was, and at first, everyone blamed her and her no-good boyfriend for Leroy's disappearance. By the end of September, the sheriff had to scale back the search for him. The weather was getting colder, the nights were getting darker, and it was looking more and more like it was a search for Leroy's body rather than a search to find him alive. And that was doubly so by the time Halloween rolled around, because how the hell was a 12-year-old kid going to survive being homeless for the better part of 2 months? Everyone was real shocked to hear how Leroy had just showed up out of nowhere. But what shocked them even more was the story he told the cops when they finally got around to interviewing him. Because when they asked him why he'd showed up with a knife and tried to stab somebody, he told them, "The devil made me do it." And I'm guessing the cops figured that it was just an excuse at first. You know, kind of like that I Don't Like Mondays killer girl, that it was blatantly just an attempt to disguise her total psychopathy. But when they asked more questions on who this devil was and how he met him, it became increasingly obvious that Leroy had been kidnapped and held by not one, but several different people. According to Leroy, he was playing outside one day when a man approached him claiming to be a friend of his father's. The guy asked if he wanted to meet him, and of course Leroy says yes, but he also said how he wasn't comfortable just wandering off with a stranger. The guy says no problem, let me go get your dad, and then returns a half hour later driving a van and telling Leroy that his dad is in the back. And little Leroy then approaches the back of the van, looks inside, and then before he even realizes it's empty, the guy shoved him into the back, closed and locked the door, and then drove off with him, screaming to be let out. Leroy said the guy drove him somewhere, someplace he'd never seen before, and had no idea how to get back to. He said he was forced into a windowless room, with nothing but a mattress and a bucket, and then kept there for so long and tortured so horribly that he lost track of time. He said he got so thirsty and hungry that it hurt, but when he begged for water, the man who took him gave him water that tasted bad, and after that he felt weird, like he was tired but different, and had dark spots in his memory. The cops asked why Leroy had told them that the devil made him do it, and he replied that although he didn't know if the man was the devil for sure, that's what he called himself. He said the only time they really talked was when the devil took him out of the room one day to meet his helpers. Leroy said that he drank some of the bad-tasting water a while before, but was still feeling woozy when the devil took him out of his room and over towards a circular dining table. Sat around it were 5 or 6 men in cloth hoods, but the man who called himself the devil was wearing a larger wooden mask that had carved horns sprouting from the top. The man calling himself the devil then introduced the men as his helpers and told Leroy that he was to obey them just like he obeyed him. And that's when Leroy said that they gave him the mask and told him what they'd given him was very important. They made him wear it, never letting him take it off all the way, not even when he ate and drank. Then, after what we know was almost 2 months in captivity, the man calling himself the devil told Leroy that the only way to get the mask off was to make a human sacrifice. Leroy said that by that time, he was ready to do just about anything for a shot at freedom, so he did exactly as the devil and his helpers asked him and attacked the trick-or-treating groups that I was a part of. He said one of Satan's helpers then walked him across the park to where our groups were trick-or-treating, gave him the bag with the knife in it, and then told him to do as he'd been told. Leroy said that the moment he killed a kid, any kid, the devil would then transport him back in time to his mom's trailer, and that it'd be like he'd never been taken at all. And that was all it took to get him close enough for us to see him, and when Mrs. Anderson called him over, I guess he saw his chance right there. I don't know exactly what happened to old Leroy after that, as in I don't know exactly where he is now or exactly how the legal process went after he was taken into custody. But I do know his mom and her boyfriend got into trouble for child endangerment and all of that, and then Leroy himself got taken to some kind of psych hospital / kiddie prison, I guess. The doctors there said there was a whole bunch of things wrong with him, but he wasn't insane or delusional, and some of the marks on his body were consistent with the methods of torture that he described to the cops. But the thing that really messed with people, and had this taking on urban legend status even after all these years, is the fact that the cops never recovered the mask. You see, after Leroy was taken down and the cops showed up, someone had already taken the mask off of him, I guess. I said a Scooby-Doo moment earlier, but it wasn't really like that. They always used to wait until everything was over and done with before taking off the bad guy's mask, right? Well, this was real life, so almost the second that they had Leroy pinned down, someone whips that thing off of him right there, and then to see who it is, because why wouldn't you? But then by the time the cops got a crime scene set up and went looking for Leroy's green goblin mask that he was supposedly wearing, no one could find that anywhere. The cops started asking folks in the neighborhood to make sure that there isn't a kid who had picked up the mask by accident. But then when no one comes forward, they start going door to door in the neighborhood to make damn sure that there hasn't been a mistake. After all, Leroy said all his captors touched the mask at some point, sometimes with their bare hands, so the cops wanted to maybe check it for fingerprints or something like that. And in fact, I think it was probably their only connection between Leroy and his supposed kidnappers. But no matter what they did, they couldn't recover the mask, and to some, it stands to reason that the person who took it did not want it to fall into the cops' hands. which means that there's a whole bunch of people who think that, right as all the chaos was unfolding after Leroy stabbed a kid, someone who looks so normal that there's not a single witness to report them just sort of walks up, picks up the mask, and then walked off into the darkness, maybe appearing as another parent. And since no one was ever arrested or convicted of Leroy's kidnapping, those same folks who think it's all some conspiracy hiding in plain sight, they believe his kidnappers are still out there, and that maybe they've been doing stuff like that for longer than we can imagine. Now, we know Leroy was kidnapped, and we know he tried to stab a kid, but as for everything else, I guess a judge might just call it hearsay. But me personally, I don't know what to believe, because from where I'm standing, much stranger things have happened and are still happening right now. I just know that what Leroy told the cops, and the fact his mask was never found, somehow scares the living hell out of me. The single most frightening, confusing, and Teresa Lynn Venegas was born on August 9, 1990. She lived in Dickinson, Texas, and had a large, loving family, which included her parents, 2 sisters, 1 brother, grandparents, and a dog named Tinkerbell. According to Teresa's sisters, that they loved doing each other's hairs and nails, all the girly things one might expect from a trio of close-knit female siblings. Both of her sisters were quoted as saying that they were each pretty envious of her long, wavy hair, but still took a lot of joy in styling it and making their younger sister look as pretty as can be. Teresa was also very close with her grandmother, Betty, who saw her home as a kind of sanctuary, a place she could escape to whenever life in her own busy family home grew too hectic. Halloween of 2006 began much like any other for Teresa, a typical Tuesday where she would head off to the nearby Dickinson High School for class and study, before heading to a friend's house after school to hang out and watch scary movies. She was a good student, and was a gregarious young lady, so it wasn't unusual for her to head right to her friend's place after school before returning home fairly late. But that night, Teresa was planning to meet up with a guy 3 years older than her, a 19-year-old, and has merely told her parents she was visiting a friend as cover for meeting this mystery guy. Teresa reportedly met him through a website, dopehouserecords.com, about 3 months prior to the meeting, and a subsequent investigation showed that he had traveled from Abilene in Texas, a 6-hour drive from Dickinson. Teresa had obviously been hoping for romance, but all she found was death. Her body was discovered in a shallow grave by a dirt bike rider on Friday, November 3rd, just a few hundred meters away from her high school. According to investigations into her cell phone records, Teresa reportedly met him through a website, dopehouserecords.com, about 3 months prior to the meeting, and a subsequent investigation showed that he had traveled from Abilene in Texas, about an 8-hour drive from Dickinson. Teresa had obviously been hoping for romance, but all she found was death. Her body was discovered in a shallow grave by a dirt bike rider on Friday, November 3rd, just a few hundred meters away from her high school. According to investigations into her cell phone records, Teresa reportedly called the record guy at around 10 p.m. that night, as she had told him she was having trouble finding a ride to his house. There is no information on how long that call was, but a record of her sent text messages revealed that told him that she was going to try and find a map at a convenience store. However, police subsequently located and interviewed the guy in question after naming him as the number 1 suspect in her murder. He denied her being in his parents' house with him, and a forensic examination discovered that he was most likely telling the truth. Not a single trace of Teresa's DNA was found in the home. Police then found multiple witnesses who stated that Teresa was in fact at a Halloween house party, specifically cited at around 11 p.m. on California Avenue. However, there is record which indicates that another witness saw her at a different party, in Bramble Lane perhaps as late as midnight. This is entirely feasible, given that the two addresses are only about a mile from each other, with Dickinson High School, where her body was found, being almost dead in the middle of the two. So despite the contradictory sightings, it's possible that Teresa could have been at both parties that evening. However, the one thing that unified the different sightings was that Teresa was spotted talking to an older man at both parties. However, it's not clear who this person was, or if it was in fact the same person present at both parties. What was clear is that Teresa didn't return home that night. The next morning, upon finding her bedroom empty, Teresa's worried parents reported her as missing. In an interview with local news stations, her grandmother said that she assumed Teresa was still with her friends, and it wasn't unusual for her to disappear for a couple of days to hang out with those friends. This prevented an initial panic for a short while, but once her body was found in a drainage ditch on an unused practice field for the high school soccer team, her family and friends were devastated. Despite not releasing many details of Teresa's death, the police made it clear that foul play was suspected. It came out later that she had been badly beaten and had somehow received cuts on her hands, but when it came to her funeral, it was a closed casket funeral. This could be down to the water damage her body endured as a result of being dumped in a drainage ditch, but it's also possible that her injuries were so gruesome that it was simply not feasible to show her body to the public. However, other sources state that Teresa's body had some of the worst signs of strangulation they'd ever seen, and that when her body was found, a belt was still tied tight around her neck. Another source revealed that almost all of Teresa's hair had been cut off, implying some kind of personal motive to the crime, or at least someone psychopathic enough to take her hair as some kind of trophy, and that she was naked from the waist down. In the days following the discovery of her corpse, and in response to an appeal by local police for any witnesses to come forward, several people reported seeing a Caucasian man with long dark hair around the high school on Halloween night. Police also found her glasses and a hair clip belonging to Teresa, not too far from the drainage ditch, concluding she had been killed in that same area following some kind of struggle. The state of her body was most definitely in line with the theory that she had been murdered where her body was found, with the killer then fleeing the scene as quickly as possible. DNA was recovered from her body, which is believed to be that of the killer, but almost exactly 15 years later, it has still not been linked to any known criminal or suspect. More than 45 people have been interviewed in relation to the case, but not a single person had been charged. Exactly 10 years to the day since her disappearance, on November 1st, 2016, the Dickinson Police Department posted on Facebook regarding her unsolved murder. The police has some interesting phrasing, saying, "There have been significant developments during that time. However, investigators are looking for additional information that would help them gather enough evidence to make an arrest and give Teresa's family closure." However, it isn't clear whether this meant that they had a new suspect and need more evidence, or that they were in the process of gathering evidence in order to officially charge a long-suspected individual. On October 29th of 2006, just a few days before Teresa disappeared, a close friend of hers named Kimberly Ramsey was reported missing by her parents. In the aftermath of Teresa's body being found, there were serious concerns that there was a significant connection between the two disappearances. Yet thankfully, Kimberly was found safe and sound on November 9th, staying with her boyfriend in Rusk, Texas. Kimberly was questioned by police regarding Teresa's murder, but this was the first she'd heard of it, and she became hysterical with grief. So it was determined that Kimberly's disappearance was merely a coincidence. It turns out that Kimberly had somewhat of a history of being a runaway, and had actually made an appearance on Dr. Phil during an episode on teenage runaways. It has also been noted that Teresa had issues with running away from home, so there is still a connection between the two girls' behavior, albeit a tenuous one. The following year, on July 15, 2007, the body of Bridget Guerin, a woman from Beaumont, was discovered on Crystal Beach. Crystal Beach is only an hour and a half's driving time from Dickinson, Texas, and is easily accessible through Galveston Island. The crime scene was eerily similar to Teresa's. Bridget was brutally beaten, strangled, and indecently assaulted, and was found dead, half naked, near a body of water. But unlike the former, Bridget was much older at 28, was Caucasian, and a legal assistant. On the other hand, Teresa was just 16, Hispanic, and a student. It is also on record that 4 suspects were linked to Bridget's murder. While we have no information about the number of suspects in Teresa's case, if indeed there were any at all. Despite there being no official law enforcement connection made between the 2 murders, it is plausible that the similarities in the murder mean they were committed by the same person, given that the relatively close time frame and the geographical proximity. Coincidentally, the 2 women also share the same middle name, Lynn. Teresa's murder is often associated with the Texas Killing Fields, a 50-mile stretch of land close to Interstate 45 between Houston and Galveston. The Killing Fields became infamous after 4 corpses were discovered near a 25-acre plot of land located near to the Calder oil field, which are only about 6 miles away from where Teresa's body was found. Since the 1970s, the cases of over 30 murders and disappearances of young women have been associated with this patch of land, which has been described as a serial killer's burial ground due to the area's distinct desolation. There are some who theorize that multiple serial killers are operating in the area, but few cases have been officially connected, and only one seems to match up with the timeline of Teresa. The book of 23-year-old Sarah Trusty was discovered in the Texas City Dike of July 28, 2002. Sarah was attacked 4 years before Teresa, with the dike being only 16 miles from Dickinson High School. It is entirely possible that whoever killed these girls might well be the same person that killed Teresa, but due to time constraints and dwindling evidence, it is also entirely possible that we may never, ever know who murdered the young Hispanic student, and that her murderer, and perhaps the murderer of many others, is still living free in the Dickinson area, just waiting for another chance to strike. The traumatizing thing that's ever happened to me happened on Halloween night of 1999. My mates and I had just started year 7, which in America is equivalent to 6th grade, starting at 11 and finishing at 12. Starting secondary school was exciting, but it also meant that we were quickly reaching the point where it was no longer acceptable to go trick-or-treating. I don't know what it's like in America, but around here, if a load of kids walk up your drive dressed like minions, of course you're going to give them a mini Mars bar or 7. But if a bunch of surly-looking almost teenagers, complete with pimples and mini stashes, start banging on someone's door, demanding chocolate under threat of vandalism, they'd be lucky to leave with broken teeth, let alone rotten ones. Now with that in mind, we knew it was a case of one last blowout, then jack it in for good in hopes of transitioning to Halloween costume parties with beers and ciggies and, most importantly, girls. But before all that, we could have one more night of wholesome costume fun and ensure a sweets haul that'll last us till Christmas if we rationed it properly. And so, in March of 1999, you might remember, The Matrix came out. I don't need to explain what The Matrix is, so I won't, and nor will I have to explain why a bunch of 11-year-old boys thought it was the best thing since sliced bread. So when it came to Halloween costumes, we decided to just be The Matrix. And not one of us either, but all of us. But then, because we didn't all have the making of a Matrix costume, 2 of us just wore school uniforms, black ties, and sunglasses, at night by the way, blind as bats. And then 2 of us wore leather jackets and sunglasses, myself included, while the 5th lad, whose sister was into all that goth music, was the only one who did the full Monty. We looked stupid, like 2 members of the village people and their security guards, but then the 5th lad, Jamie, he actually looked the bee's knees now that I look back on it. He had the long leather trench coat, extra long since he borrowed it from his older sister. He had the little sunglasses, like the ones Morpheus actually wears, and he had his hair all slicked back with hair gel too, with some army boots, black jeans, and a black t-shirt on to complete the look. He actually looked fantastic, to be honest, but he also stood out like a sore thumb walking around neighborhoods where kids were dressed as Woody or Buzz from Toy Story. And so we start knocking on these houses, and We either get pensioners asking, "What the bloody hell are you lot dressed as?" or young blokes laughing when they instantly recognize what we were supposed to be. It was a really good laugh, actually, and we made our way up and down the streets near where we lived until eventually we ran out of houses to knock at. It was only about 7:30 by that time, and none of us had to be back inside until 10 at the earliest, so we still had ages to kill and very little to do. But then, Jamie had an idea. Instead of just going home, we could walk down a road a bit and cross over the dual carriageway and then knock at some houses in the neighborhood across from us. We all agreed that was a good idea because who wouldn't want more mini chocolate bars? There was just one small problem. We'd have to pass the Homewood estate. Homewood is probably one of the roughest areas of Bradford. That's not to say that the vast majority of people who live there aren't friendly and welcoming, because 99% of the time, you can walk and drive around the area and not get even an ounce of trouble. It's just never been the safest place to be after dark, especially not for a group of 11-year-olds dressed like debt collectors on their way to a rave. But then, we had ourselves a little plan. Instead of walking down one of the larger roads past the estate, we'd walk through the alley near the train tracks, which would minimize our exposure to the estate while passing it to get to the other neighborhood. Now, sorry for the logistical briefing there, but I'm just giving you an idea of why we thought it was a good plan to go walking down an alleyway after dark while dressed like a German industrial band. We thought that we wouldn't run into any of the bad lads who lived on the estate, but little did we know, they were hanging out in the one place we didn't want to bump into them. So about halfway down the alleyway, there's a blind 90-degree turn, then you can't really see much at the end of the alley either. We thought that gave us cover, and it did, but it also meant that we couldn't see what was around either bend. We round the first one, and there's no one there, so we think brilliant, we're in the free and clear. But then we round the second corner, and we run into half a dozen of the very people we hoped not to run into. I didn't know all the lads' names, but I do remember 3 of them. The main 2 were the Hand twins. Francis and Anthony Hand were both boxers and had the reputations to match. They'd been in trouble with the police, mainly because they loved to fight, but they were partial to just about any kind of crime you can imagine. So robbing a few costume kids of their sweets was really nothing to them, especially since we were considered fair game. And by that I mean of a certain age and male, so not too shameful to rob and possibly slap around some kids like us for a bit. And so the second we round the corner, there's obviously this massive uh-oh moment for us. But the Hand twins and company just burst out laughing. They obviously knew what we were dressed as. Everyone of a certain age did, because the Matrix was bloody massive at the time, but they weren't exactly the type to go giving us compliments on how much effort we put into our various costumes. Instead, they saw fit to try and humiliate us. They were laughing their heads off, shouting stuff like, "These dickheads think they're in the bloody Matrix." And we tried our best to just ignore them, which was stupid really, because when lads like that sense any kind of weakness, you're well and truly buggered. And so despite trying to just walk around them, they were in no mood to simply let us pass. It started when they noticed our bags of sweets, at which point one of the Hand twins started saying something like, "Look, boys, they brought us all their sweets." And they started trying to grab one of our lads' bags of sweets, saying something like, "You're too old to be dressing up like that, and too fat to be eating those sweets." Which, to be fair, he probably was, but just because we couldn't fight back didn't mean we were about to just let ourselves be bullied. So, one of them trying to rob our mate's bag of sweets, but our mate saying, "No, get off me, you wanker." He's not throwing punches or anything, but the confrontation was exactly what the Hand twins and company were looking for. So as soon as there's a bit of argy-bargy, the Hands and friends spread out along the street so we couldn't pass at all. We didn't all shout run or anything, but there was this very recognizable moment where we all just kind of looked at each other thinking, we're in trouble here. Then when the first one of us turned around and ran back down the alley, the rest of us followed. But so did the Hand twins, who with their boys behind them went chasing us like the clappers of hell. We ran like lads possessed, and since we were running down a blind entry, There was only one way we could all run. But then, once we rounded the corner and sprinted to the end of the alleyway, there was no plan on where we were all running to. Two of the lads ran left, probably with the intention of running backwards towards our neighborhood, but the other three of us ran right. This was definitely not a good idea, as we'd have to walk back the way we came if we wanted to get home. But in the moment, all we were thinking was run, run, run. So I just acted on instinct and ran right with my two mates. After the turn, we were faced with quite a long, straight road with a wall on one side and trees on the other. I happened to notice that to our right, where the trees were, there was a little gap in a chain-link fence, and on instinct, I just ran for it. I didn't really know what was on the other side. It all looked abandoned and overgrown, but I thought, in that case, it'd be a good place to hide. I thought my mates would follow me because, being the faster runner, I'd managed to overtake them by the time that I'd spotted the chain-link fence. I thought they'd see me spotting a hiding place and would be right on my tail, but the Hand twins and company were much closer than I first thought. If they'd have done the same as me and run for the fence, they'd have been slowed down trying to force their way through the gap, and the Hand twins gang would have caught up with them. But then, being at the front, I didn't know that. So after bursting through the fence and looking over my shoulder, my first thoughts were this weird mix of, oh no, I'm alone, and oh thank God, because it didn't look like anyone was following me. Through the metal gates of whatever abandoned plot I was on, I saw my mates running past, then what looked like all of the Hand twins' crew, so there was this wash of relief that passed over me. I didn't stop running though. I was still scared out of my wits and wanted to find a hiding place. So that's what I did, and it basically involved sitting in a bush that had a view of the front entrance so I could be hidden whilst being aware of my surroundings. If this had happened a few years later, we'd have all had mobiles to call each other on, but it was 1999, and I know people had mobiles back then, but not 5 working-class 11-year-olds from Bradford. And so instead of being able to do some information gathering, I had no choice but to sit there in my leather jacket with my bag of sweets and just wait until I thought the coast was suitably clear. I'm not sure how long I waited, but it felt like a long time. Then just as I started to think, yeah, I might be safe to run home, I saw someone walking on the other side of the metal gate toward where the gap in the fence was. Obviously, I froze in place, not being able to see who it was, just knowing someone was there, and that it might have been one of the lads chasing us. But then I remember thinking, if it was one of the lads chasing us, then why are they walking? They seemed to be walking quite calmly too, not even a brisk walk or jog to suggest that they had any urgency around them whatsoever. I started to think, it's okay, this is probably just some dog walker. Then just as I was about to climb out of the bush I'd secreted myself in, I heard something that turned my blood to ice. It was the sound of the chain-link fence rattling. Someone was forcing their way in. I couldn't see who it was straight away. There were a few trees blocking my view of that portion of the fence, but I think I knew deep down that it must have been one of that Hand crew because I didn't even have to see them to know that I'd had to get back into the bush, crouch down and pray that no one found me. I then watched as a lad called Fernsey stepped out from behind the trees. I didn't know him personally, I just knew him by that nickname, Fernsey. He didn't know me either, and although we'd seen each other around town, we'd never spoken a word in exchange. He had no reason to hate me, no reason to want to kick the shite out of me and rob my sweets, but that didn't stop him from chasing me, and for some reason, that scared me even more than the prospect of getting the crap beaten out of me. But even scarier was seeing him start to actively and methodically hunt for me. I didn't think anyone had seen me dart through the chain-link fence, otherwise surely they'd have immediately chased me. But as it turns out, someone had seen me, and they were in no rush to come back. I didn't know Homewood all that well, you see, and they knew something I didn't. Fernsey didn't say anything as he stalked closer and closer to the bush I was in. He couldn't see me, but by the time he got within a few feet, he bolted it and ran as fast as I could out the back of the bush. I ran and ran, thinking there'd be some kind of way out ahead of me, but there wasn't. There was only this big brick wall at the back of whatever abandoned plot I was on, and the only chance I had of scaling it was to climb a tree that was off to my right, then hop over the wall after darting along one of its branches. And so I ran, and when I got there, I dropped my bag of sweets and started to climb, but it wasn't fast enough. I was just about to scramble up a low branch I'd managed to grab onto when I just felt this pair of hands take hold of my leg. Fernsey pulled me down so hard that I grazed my hands on the branch and was dragged out of my grip, and as I fell, I landed so awkwardly that I felt this shooting pain go through my ankle before I collapsed to the floor. I don't know if I genuinely thought that me being hurt would deter Fernsey from beating me up, or if that was just pure wishful thinking on my part, but it didn't make a blind bit of difference. I kept saying to him stuff like, "Please, no, stop, I think I broke my ankle." But it was like he wasn't listening at all. He just started kicking me, over and over again, aiming for my head, but sometimes getting my chest and shoulder, and my arm, which I was using to cover my head. He just kept kicking me, until in the end, I made one final attempt to beg him to stop, which unfortunately meant that he had a nice little window to land a full-force kick right in my face. I don't think I was knocked out, but I was definitely stunned. The pain that shot through my nose and mouth was like nothing I'd ever felt before, and all I could do was lie there, holding my face and head while groaning for him to stop. I don't think it could get any worse. I mean, I was scared that he might kill me or something, mostly by accident and one of those "it was only a prank" that turns deadly. But aside from that, I really didn't think I had much else to worry about. But then, Fernsey started trying to pull my pants down. And that's how I know I wasn't knocked out, because I felt it. And when I did, I started to scream in a way I didn't know I was capable of. I actually didn't know what he was planning at the time. I was too young and naive to think boys were in any danger of that. I just thought that he wanted to humiliate me even further by making me walk back home in the nude. And with that in mind, it was my turn to attack him. Although, to be fair, my attempt was laughably ineffective. However, what throwing punches and kicking out at him did do was ensure that I bought myself just enough time for the hand twins to show up. At first, this was terrifying to me, as it looked like Fernsey now had backup to finish whatever humiliation he was planning. But in some weird twist of fate, it was those hand twins who saved me from what was about to happen. They started laughing at Fernsey, not with him, but at him, and all because he'd got my pants halfway down, and just in case I haven't made it clear already, I'm a boy, not a girl. And they were asking him what he was planning, like sort of making fun of him, calling him gay and stuff like that, and they got him to stop immediately, but then instead of trying to strip me, he started kicking the crap out of me again. The hand twins were like, "Whoa, what are you doing?" because they could see what the state I was already in, and they just wanted to scare us and rob us of our sweets, not bloody kill us. One of the brothers, I think his name was Francis, then started slapping Fernsey around, saying how he hated bullies, which is ironic because that's the exact thing they were doing to us, it seemed like. They didn't let me leave with my sweets, but they did let me pull my pants up and leave, which, to be honest, was all I really wanted to do anyway. I never told anyone what Fernsey tried to do, and if you're probably wondering why I haven't used many names, is because I still want a little bit of anonymity in all of this. As for Fernsey, I don't think that matters anymore because he's no longer with us. 7 years after that incident, Fernsey was stabbed to death on a quiet street after a car with 4 lads hit him at 50 miles an hour. People just thought it was some kind of gang beef, but the way they killed him makes me think it was something a bit more personal, and that perhaps I wasn't the only one that Fernsey had tried to do something terrible to. McCamey Manor is arguably the most terrifying and controversial haunted attraction in the United States today. Yet what makes McCamey Manor so different from the others is that there are no zombies, ghosts, or werewolves to frighten visitors. Instead, members of staff are permitted to bind, gag, and push visitors to their physical and emotional limits. Obviously, it's not something the average horror fan is going to enjoy, and there are several entry requirements. Visitors must be at least 21 years of age and must pass a physical exam, a drug test, and a background check. McCamey Manor operates all year round, although interest tends to peak during the Halloween season and actually offers visitors a hefty $20,000 if they are able to survive for more than 10 hours. According to the Manor's founder, Russ McCamey, not a single visitor has ever managed to endure the full experience. The reason why the Manor is so controversial is because nobody is saying what's actually happening in here, and that's out of respect for the Manor and myself and what we're trying to produce here, he said during a recent interview. If the people who go through the haunt want to spill all the beans and say everything that happens, they certainly could, but they don't, and that makes the haters crazy because they don't know what's happening. That's why you hear all the insane rumors, because they're just making things up in their mind of what is happening. Since there is no entrance fee, the Manor is extremely selective, and just a handful of patrons are permitted to enter each weekend. McCamey also requires that his participants refrain from physically engaging with the actors or from using curse words. Breaking these rules are grounds for an immediate cessation of the tour. Based in Tennessee and Alabama, the Manor advertises itself as an audience participation event in which you will live your own horror movie. But critics have described it as a torture chamber. Even other members of the Halloween haunt industry have leveled some serious criticism at the place, branding Russ McCamey as a psychopath who's managed to find a legal loophole to satisfy an evil, sadistic streak. Upon being granted permission to enter, visitors are required to sign a 40-page waiver prior to the tour. The waiver asks that the visitors understand and agree to the fact that not only were they warned multiple times not to participate in McCamey Manor, but that it is only a game, and they are not really being tortured, although they will be roughed up and may well suffer some degree of physical injury during their visit. One particularly ominous line from the waiver states that McCamey Manor is not for the weak, but that visitors will never be held against their will. The only things off limits to the staff are explicit situations in which they might be intimate, but visitors may have their heads shaved or even their fingers broken, since mouth traps are used to inflict discomfort or pain. There are also clauses stating that dangerous heights or even poisonous animals may well be used to terrify participants. But perhaps most terrifyingly of all, the waiver states that participants may be buried alive, specifically under 12 feet of dirt, although they are promised access to a limited amount of air. But Amy Milligan, a Californian who visited McCamey Manor, insisted that her experience was more than just a game. She asserted that she suffered injuries that were way beyond cuts and bruises, and was even waterboarded by members of staff while they laughed in the face of her obvious suffering. She only left a positive review of her experience that McCamey would upload footage of her time there to their YouTube channel, which she intended to use as evidence of excessive abuse. Yet when it was uploaded, she found the worst parts had been tactically edited out. "I told them I can't do this, please let me out," she later said. "But they told me they weren't done yet. They shoved my head back in a bucket of water. I thought I was going to die in there." Another Californian, Laura Hertz Brotherton, has a similar story to Mulligan's. She too was left with more than just superficial injuries. Brotherton says that before she was allowed to participate, she was asked to prove her loyalty to McCamey Manor by completing a series of tasks, some of which included purchasing an adult onesie and filming a personal visit to a Halloween store before uploading the evidence to Facebook. According to Brotherton, she believed that McCamey was particularly hard on her after she admitted to having become involved in an extramarital affair. She insisted that, for some reason, Russ McCamey was personally offended by this. "I was waterboarded, tased, and whipped. I still have scars of everything they did to me," she later said. "I was repeatedly hit in my face, like open-handed, as hard as a man could hit a woman." Brotherton added that she was blindfolded, then held by her ankles and submerged under water for so long that her body started involuntarily thrashing. She was later forced to dig a hole in the dirt with her bare hands, then made to lie in the fresh hole while they covered her and her face with dirt, giving her only a straw to breathe through. It was then that she repeated her safe word several times, only being freed from her live burial after having screamed it at the top of her lungs. When it was all over, Brotherton visited a hospital but refused to reveal to the hospital staff exactly who or what had caused her injuries. As is standard practice in such incidents, hospital staff called the police, but Brotherton left prior to their arrival. She later worked up the courage to report the incident to law enforcement, but was told she didn't have a case because of the waiver. Brotherton then took photographs of her injuries. In one photo, she is wearing a neck brace and hospital gown, with her face showing signs of swelling. She also had scratches on her cheeks and small cuts at the corners of her mouth from fish hooking, where a person takes their fingers and puts them inside your mouth before stretching your mouth open. Another photograph shows a large open wound on one of her knees, apparently from where McCamey's staff forced her to crawl on rough ground. According to an article written about her experiences, Russ McCamey confirmed Brotherton's story, though he did shed doubt on the severity of her injuries. Yet the article also goes on to state that some of McCamey's claims are pure fantasy, that there's no alligator, there's no quicksand, and most of all, there's no 20 grand prize for those that last longer than 10 hours. McCamey himself then posted on Facebook regarding the article, saying it was based on pure speculation and exaggerated stories. He had apparently reached out to the publication in question to offer them access to other visitors who would contradict Brotherton's assertions, but was ignored. He also claimed that he had been in touch with other extreme attractions and discovered that Brotherton had been banned by them for other salacious claims. According to McCamey, the article was an opinion piece, masquerading as a piece of investigative journalism. It was then he laid out a challenge to the journalist who wrote the piece, stating there was one simple way of her determining what was fact and fiction. Take the tour. What do you have to lose? He wrote. Do you have what it takes? But we know you'll never do that. Instead, you'll sit behind your desk in the comfort of your safe space, writing about second-hand information instead of actually seeking the truth from your own experience. Russ McCamey, a self-proclaimed cinemaphile, uploaded videos of the tours to the McCamey Manor YouTube channel, but he has since ceased to do so because of negative public reactions. Yet McCamey hasn't stopped uploading footage of the tours entirely. According to Facebook users who are members of the McCamey Manor private Facebook group, McCamey still shares video, even occasionally live-streaming some of the tours. These videos boast professional editing, lighting, and props, raising questions as to whether or not some of the tours are actually staged. One video shows a group of visitors reading the infamous waiver aloud before the camera documents them signing it. The people attempting to read the waiver aloud then have their hair pulled, get smacked in the face, and are choked with rope while trying to read. Footage later shows the individuals having their hair shaved off before being forced to eat it, and being forced to eat raw, dead animals. These acts lead some people to speculate that the video is staged, and that the participants themselves are actually members of the manor's staff. According to McCamey's Facebook post, the chance to win $20,000 is absolutely real. However, it is very suspicious that not a single visitor has ever been able to claim the prize. McCamey has stated that although the prize exists, it's impossible to attain, which is arguably the strongest evidence that it doesn't exist. Perhaps the most interesting question is how McCamey is able to fund the manor. Russ McCamey is a Navy veteran and does not profit off the manor, but was somehow able to invest $500,000 of his own money into the establishment of the manor in San Diego. According to McCamey himself, he spends almost $300 a night for an on-site EMT and around $20 grand a year on insurance. He also estimates that it costs around $500 per visitor. So just how is the manor funded? According to rumor, McCamey sells footage of the tours on the deep web, as well as taking a cut from a betting syndicate who watch the live streams from a top-secret location, somewhere in the U.S. But these contradict McCamey's claims that he doesn't profit off the manor in any shape or form. McCamey himself has admitted to money troubles after losing his job as a veterans advocate, and his only source of income is his $800 monthly retirement check. There has also been fiery debate on the legality of operating McCamey Manor. For example, The police have been called to McCamey Manor on more than one occasion, at one point arriving to find a woman locked in a basement, shivering and bruised with duct tape over her mouth. When police asked the woman if the interaction was consensual, the woman said yes, giving the cops no option other than to leave. According to the district attorney of Lawrence County, Tennessee, McCamey Manor operates well within the law, given their use of waivers. As long as McCamey participants are there voluntarily, no crime is being committed. However, a participant can withdraw consent at any time, and if staff were to disregard the withdrawal of consent, a participant would then be classified as a victim who is being held against their will. Russ McCamey also makes clear that the Manor's Tennessee location is far less physically involved than it was in San Diego, being more of a psychological experience than a physical one. There's no torture, there's nothing like that, but under hypnosis, if you make someone believe there's something really scary going on, that's just in their own mind and not reality. He stated in another Facebook post, "If you are good enough and you're able to get inside somebody's noggin, like the way that I can make folks believe whatever I want them to believe. I'm like the most straight-laced guy you could think of, but here I run this crazy haunted house, and people twist it around in their little minds. It really is a magic act, what I do. It's a lot of smoke and mirrors." However, that isn't to say people escape the manor unharmed. McCamey stands by the possibility that one may leave with cuts, bruises, or even broken bones, as stated in the waiver. In short, McCamey Manor may well be one of the greatest mysteries in the entire entertainment industry, and by the looks of things, it will remain that way, despite incredible pressure on Russ McCamey to shut the place down. People have sent me death threats, even shot at my house, and I'm not going to open it to the masses. I like keeping it a secret, he said. I like the mystery of the manor. If you saw everything, it'd be like any other haunted house. That's my goal, even when I'm dead and gone, to make sure people are still talking about McCamey Manor. And that's why nobody is really going to ever see behind the wall. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/Let'sReadOfficial and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Russ is sus. My name is Martin, and I've been listening to your YouTube videos since the summer, and since Halloween is coming up, I thought now would be as good a time as ever to share something personal with you. I say personal, but it didn't strictly happen to me. It happened to my dad. But as you can imagine, having something terrible happen to my dad was something I took extremely personally. I grew up in High Wycombe, a town of less than 100,000 people that sits on the northwestern edges of London. I feel like I got the best of both worlds growing up because London is only about half an hour away by train, but High Wycombe is surrounded by countryside and parks, so it's not nearly as fast-paced as life in the capital. London has quite a lot of crime, relatively speaking anyways, whereas High Wycombe is the kind of place where, if there's even so much as a burglary, the whole town is shocked. That kind of thing makes me feel lucky to have been brought up there because the violence and apathy of the big city hasn't yet permeated their way into the country. Then, back in 2018, something happened on Halloween night that made everyone think those days of innocent tranquility were over. Just like everywhere else in the UK, kids in High Wycombe are exposed to a lot of American culture via movies and TV programs. So when it comes to late October, they want to dress up, have a Halloween party, and go trick-or-treating. I say that thing about American culture because my parents were always fond of telling me that when they were kids, there was no such thing as trick-or-treating, and everyone looked forward to bonfire night instead, which is only a few days later on Remember, the 5th of November. Anyway, so come Halloween night, there are quite a few trick-or-treaters roaming the dark, rainy streets of High Wycombe, terrorizing pensioners with demands for Haribo. But I only got a brief glimpse of them because I was headed to a Halloween get-together over at a friend's house. It was a weeknight, a Wednesday if I remember correctly, so although I couldn't stay out too late, I was 17 at the time and had sixth form in the morning, I was excited to sneak a few beers in my mate's back garden. His parents were really chill like that. As long as we didn't take the piss and get too loud, then we were fine to have a few cans. I got there at about 5 after I'd arrived home from school and changed, while my mate's parents said that we'd all have to make our way home by 11. But then, after a few hours of light drinking and hanging out, my mate's mom came out into the back garden to tell me that my mom had just been on the phone. I asked if everything was okay, and my mate's mom said they had to go home right away. I asked why, and my mate's mom said that she didn't know, only that my own mother had called her, asking to make sure that I was on my way home immediately. I remember one of my mates being like, "Uh-oh, what have you gone and done now?" And the implication being that I was in trouble somehow. I was actually convinced that was the case myself, and as I walked back home, I was racking my brain trying to figure out exactly what I'd done to warrant having my evening interrupted like that. I arrived back home, just about ready to face the music, but after unlocking the door and walking inside, things didn't go anywhere near how I expected them to. Usually speaking, if I was in trouble, the first thing that I'd hear when walking through the door is, "Andrew, me and your mom would like a word with you." And that was generally the sign that I was about to get a bollocking, and it was usually my dad who delivered that stern opening address. But that night, on Halloween night back in 2018, it was my mom who had called me into the front room, and she didn't sound angry at all. She sounded terrified. It feels weird looking back on it now because at the time I just knew something had happened to my dad. He should have been home when I got back at around 10 p.m., but he wasn't. And then the fact that my mom seemed so upset over something, I just picked up on it right away. Before she could even say anything else, I walked into the front room and asked, "Where's Dad?" And she just replied, "Dad's in the hospital." Then she told me to sit down. I asked, "Is he going to die?" And my mom said, "No." But that something had happened that meant that he probably is going to be scarred for life. I was extremely relieved to hear that he wasn't going to die, and I had this weird feeling that whatever came next would be fine. And I know that sounds weird, maybe a little bit callous, but it was like, no matter what my mom said next, at least he's not dead. It might be some life-changing injury, but at least I'm not going to lose him. That kind of emotional whiplash definitely helped me put things into perspective. But what happened to my dad was absolutely atrocious, and something I find chillingly disturbing even nearly 6 years later. While I was at my mate's house, chilling in his back garden, quite literally with it being October, my mom and dad had been receiving a steady stream of trick-or-treaters. The majority of them came between about 6 and 7. Then as it got closer to 8 o'clock, the knocks on the door were getting fewer and further between. About 7:45, Mom and Dad got one last knock at the door. Mom said that she remembered telling my dad how they were almost out of sweets to hand out and how next year he should buy more. Dad gets up, walks to the door, then opens it up. But instead of seeing a group of kids in fancy dress calling out trick-or-treat, there's just one grown-up standing there with some kind of white ghost mask on. My dad takes one look at this bloke and says something like, "You're having a laugh, aren't you, mate?" And the bloke doesn't say anything in response. Instead, he started to unscrew a bottle of what my dad said looked like pink Lucozade. My dad said he sort of knew that it must have been some kind of prank, and he had a feeling the bloke was about to try and give him a Lucozade shower. So when he launched the liquid at my dad, he darted behind our door so that the liquid landed and hit him on the face and on the part of his foot that wasn't covered by a slipper. The guy with the bottle then legged it really fast away, and my dad said that he thought it was weird to not hear any kind of laughter or anything like that. And this is also in the age of smartphones, so my dad also expected to maybe see someone filming the whole thing from the street, but there was no one there. Some rando had literally walked up our drive, all alone, thrown Lucozade onto my dad, and then just ran off. But that confusion only lasted a few short seconds for my father, because just moments after that pink liquid touched his skin, it started to burn. Mom said that she just heard my dad suddenly yelping like he was in loads of pain. Then when she ran out to see what was happening, a patch of skin on the side of his face was blistering and bleeding. Neither of them had any idea what was going on until the ambulance was on their way, at which point my dad started realizing that whatever was in that lad's bottle was not Lucozade, and that it was some kind of corrosive acid. Mom said that he was shouting at her to grab some baking soda or bleach because he thought that he could neutralize the chemical reaction, but Mom was on the phone to the ambulance when that happened, and when she asked the lady on the phone if that's what she should do, the woman gave her clear instructions not to try and neutralize it, or it might make things worse. They still didn't know what kind of substance the guy had thrown onto my dad, so until they did, they were to just wait until medical professionals had arrived before they started treatment. Dad was in agony by the time they arrived, but he still had enough about him to tell my mom to wait at home so I wouldn't arrive back to an empty house and then potentially see something on the news. We were allowed to visit him the next day before he went into surgery for a skin graft, and seeing my dad like that was really hard on both me and my mom. He was full of strong painkillers, so despite his injuries, he seemed to be feeling quite perky, and the irony wasn't lost on us that it was him telling us to stop worrying, and that everything would be fine instead of us providing him with any comfort. His skin graft operation went really well, and from where the burn was on his face, you can't really tell he's even scarred unless you look really carefully in the right light. But that was only one part of the puzzle solved. The other part was why the effing hell he'd been targeted in the first place. It kills me to even have to type it out, but the police never caught who threw acid at my dad. But I think that it might have something to do with another acid attack that had happened just the previous year. Don't sue me if I get this bit wrong, because it's all from memory, but it 100% happened and there's news articles about it out there, and if you're interested, you can read more about it. But to my memory, this is what happened. Some guy drove up from London to square up against a local guy, I think from a beef that started on social media, I guess. The Londoner then tracked the local lad down to a park and was carrying a bottle of acid when he confronted him. Now, this is the part that really sends me. The local lad, suspecting that there was acid in the bottle, basically karate kicked the bottle out of his hand as soon as he unscrewed the cap. But then the acid went flying into a woman sitting on a bench nearby, and when she realized what was happening, she was rushed to the hospital. My dad was okay. He got his skin grafted, spent about a week in hospital recovering, and then got sent home. This poor woman, on the other hand, ended up getting a skin infection which then killed her. That could have been my dad. It could have very easily have been my dad under the exact same circumstances. I don't know how the poor woman ended up with a skin infection, but she did. It seems like just the luck of the draw almost. She lost her life because some absolute scrote decided to use acid as a weapon one day. She was rushed to hospital, operated on, all the same stuff as my father, but she lost her life and he didn't. And just writing that out makes me feel so lucky that I could cry. The woman who died was a mother of 3. Her kids must have been absolutely beyond heartbroken, plus horrified that it was bloody acid and a subsequent infection that had killed their mom. Why didn't that happen to me? Why them and not us? I'm not saying I think my dad should have died or anything. No one should have to go before their time like that, especially not in such a horrible way. But the thing that really plays on my mind these days is just that, why them and not us? Another reason I was inspired to write this is the fact that another acid attack happened in London just the other day. I heard it was 2 schoolgirls that got it thrown on them, most likely by a boy that had been rejected after asking one of them out. I support calls for tougher sentences for acid attackers, but it also makes me think, like, how many more times is this going to happen? And in my darker moments, I don't think it'll ever stop. I have this sick feeling that acid attacks are just part of our life now. That if you piss someone off big enough, they won't just beat you up or want to fight or anything else like that. They'll just buy some acid off the internet and throw it in your face. Because with something like that, if you live the rest of your life with horrible scarring, you're considered one of the lucky ones. Because the unlucky ones, like that poor woman sitting on the bench that day, don't get to walk away with their lives intact. So rest in peace to her and to my dad. I love you, and I'm glad you're still here. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Fernsey started trying to pull my pants down. What? One of my earliest childhood memories is going trick-or-treating around the neighborhood that I grew up in. I didn't have much of a costume because I only decided last minute that I wanted to join my big brother. I've been terrified at the idea of all these miniature monsters walking around outside, but that fear was gradually and eventually outweighed by the promise of a huge haul of Halloween candy. My mom used some leftover monster makeup to paint my face like a skeleton, and then I wore a torn-up trash bag like I was some kind of garbage ghoul. And I must have looked pretty silly compared to some of the other kids in their Batman and Superman costumes, but that didn't really bother me. All I was interested in was getting my fair share of candy, and boy, was there lots of that. My brother was 13 at the time, so he agreed to escort 9-year-old me around the neighborhood with him and his friends from middle school. And I couldn't believe that I'd been so frightened by the whole thing, because actually being out there, knocking on doors and showing off our costumes, it was some of the most fun I'd ever had in my entire young life. People were giving us a ton of candy, and not just candy either. They were giving us all kinds of things. One house we knocked at, I think it was the town dentist, gave us all toothbrushes and then reveled in our looks of disappointment because they revealed that they were just kidding and gave us some real candy. Another place gave us all these miniature Charlie Brown comic books. But at one point, a man told me to open up my candy bag and then drop something small and white into it before walking off. I didn't realize Halloween was like Christmas, only spookier, and by the time me and my brother arrived back home, I think it had fast become my favorite holiday. The next thing I remember, our mom asked us to empty out our bags of candy at either ends of the kitchen table. Her plan was to take maybe 3/4 of what we'd gotten, then put it somewhere safe so we couldn't eat ourselves into a diabetic coma. But shortly after emptying my bag onto the table, Mom came over to divide up the spoils and took one look through my candy and then immediately started to freak out. She kept pointing at this one particular item and asking me, "Honey, where did you get this? Who gave this to you?" Then when I told her I didn't know, she kept yelling at me to think harder, that I had to remember who put it in my bag. I remember getting upset and starting to cry, and then crying even harder when my mom picked up the phone and told the operator to put her through to the police, because in her words, this was an emergency. Now 30 years before, back when my mom was around my age, all the kids in the town we grew up in went trick-or-treating on Halloween. One little girl went out with her friends, but didn't just come home with a bag full of candy. She returned home with a little white doll stitched out of cloth rags. The girl's mom didn't think anything of it and let her daughter keep the little white doll. But just a few days later, there was an incident in a public park. The girl's mom took her to the park, someplace that had like a sand pit and a jungle gym, and while her kids were off playing with the other children, she strikes up a conversation with one of the other moms. The whole time, some guy had been leaning on the fence surrounding the jungle gym. The lady figured that he must have been one of the kids' fathers, maybe even grandfathers, just watching on as his kids or grandkids played with all the others. But then, as the mom's looking on, she sees the guy get her daughter's attention, call her over towards the fence, and then starts talking to her. Again, this all appeared perfectly harmless, but then the mom watches as the guy who's wearing a long coat, hat, and a scarf, just covered up so his face is slightly obscured, reaches out and asks for her hand. The mom watches as her little girl gives the man her hand, and then when the guy leaned forward and appeared to start smelling her little girl's hand, she starts walking over to intervene. She tells her kid to get away from the strange man, then starts asking him what his business is talking to children like that. The guy didn't say a word. He just turned around and walked off before the mom could actually confront him. Naturally, the mom wanted to know what the man had said to her little girl, but when she asked her, the answer she got back raised more questions than they answered. First off, the little girl said she couldn't understand what the man was saying to her, but when her mom asked how she knew to walk over and give the man her hand, all at his direction, she acted very confused and then said she didn't know. The girl also said that when he raised her hand to the man, he hadn't sniffed it, like her mom thought he had. Instead, he'd said something to it, something which again the little girl couldn't understand. The girl's mom then asked if she knew the man from anywhere, like if she'd seen him around town, and the girl replied yes. It was the same man who'd given her the little white doll while she was trick-or-treating. As you can imagine, the mom was terrified, and in discovering the connection between the doll and that creepy man, she rushed to inform the police. The cops put out some APB on the guy, and almost every cop in town was out looking for him, but after no one caught sight of him, they figured that he'd been a drifter that had skipped town at the first sight of trouble. None of the moms from the park recognized the guy, which, in a town our size, usually meant that he was an out-of-towner. So when 48 hours went by, and there had been no sightings of the guy from either civilians or law enforcement, everyone just kind of figured the guy had moved on. It took just days before they realized how wrong they were. One morning, a young mom walked into her daughter's bedroom to wake her up for elementary school, only to find that she wasn't in her bed. She looked around the house a little, then when she realized her daughter was nowhere to be found, she alerted her husband, who in turn called the cops. And within 24 hours, almost every cop in the state was out looking for this missing girl. But while a whole army of cops and volunteers are out searching the fields and woods surrounding town, a team of state police detectives performed a search of the girl's bedroom, I'm guessing to see if they could find any clues. And guess what they found? Tucked into the missing girl's pillowcase, a little white doll, one that looked like it had been stitched out of old rags. The police then held a press conference asking if anyone else's kid was in possession of one of these little white dolls. Only one set of parents came forward saying their little girl also had returned home from trick-or-treating with a little white doll in her candy bag, and that little girl just so happened to be my mom's best friend. I bet you thought I was going to say that little girl was my mom, didn't you? I can't blame you. And so did I when I first heard that story from her. But even so, she was half traumatized by the whole thing because not only did her friend and her parents almost have a nervous breakdown out of fear, but they also ended up moving out of town because their kid just couldn't feel safe there anymore. Mom said that she and everyone at school was convinced the man would come back in the middle of the night and snatch her up out of bed just like he'd done with that missing girl, who, by the way, was never found. No corpse or remains ever showed up anyplace. There were no credible witness sightings of her anywhere despite all the public appeals, and they didn't even find any articles of clothing or anything like that. It was like that little girl just vanished off the face of the earth, and that only gave credence to the theory, propagated by local kids, that the child snatcher had been some kind of boogeyman who targeted children with little white dolls on Halloween before eating them alive on the nights that followed. Obviously, that's not what happened, but it also wasn't like adults could tell their kids the whole truth. All they could say was that the girl was lost and that everyone hoped she'd come home safe one day. But no one believed that. Not really, anyway. In fact, a quick death would actually have been one of the more merciful options available, given the circumstances of a grown man abducting a little girl from her bed at night. I mean, again, it's unlikely the guy crept inside and snatched the kid kicking and screaming from her bed. The dolls were to win the kid's trust, so when the time came, they'd come quietly, not loudly. And go quietly she did because, as I said, no one found any trace of this girl or her abductor, and she was declared legally dead around the same time I graduated college. The town moved on, but no one forgot, especially the ones close to the whole thing, which explained why my mom got so scared when she emptied my bag of candy onto the table and saw a little white doll stitched out of old rags lying among the chocolate bar and candy wrappers. As you can imagine, she too rushed to call 911, and after the cops got a hold of the little white doll, the whole town basically went into lockdown while they searched for the person that might have placed it in my bag. No kid was allowed to go anywhere alone for days, and when the commotion died down, the cops said it was most likely some kind of copycat just looking to scare people. They figured it was probably some teenager who'd heard the story of the little white dolls, along with that of the girl who went missing just days after they were handed out. They didn't think they were seriously going to complete the copycat process and try to abduct any kids who received dolls. I wasn't the only one. But given the weight of police presence on the streets come November 1st, there was a good chance it was that and that alone which deterred the copycat from going through with it. I didn't hear the whole story until many years later, and while my dad thought the whole thing was dumb and that it was just kids being kids, it had quite a heavy effect on my mom, I guess because it brought back all those bad memories from her childhood. I mostly believe it was a copycat too, as in someone just playing a dumb prank, because no one ever tried to snatch any of his kids who got the dolls, not even years later. But sometimes I wonder how much of a prank it really was. If the whole town didn't take the dolls seriously, or the guy hadn't picked my candy bag to drop one into so that my mom didn't see it, would things have still happened the way they did? Or would have another kid have gone missing in the middle of the night, snatched up by the man who made the little white dolls?
This happened 2 years ago on Halloween of 2023. I'm a 25-year-old male, but at the time of this story, I was 22. I had a long day of work due to a festival we had where we had parents bring their kids to the center for various activities, such as many different competitive games, a costume contest, trivia for candy, and a kids vs. parents dodgeball game. Overall, it was a very fun time, but it was definitely tiring. For context, I'm a community worker, so doing community events is pretty much what I do on a normal basis, but it's also draining if that makes sense. Anyway, after it was all done, I went home and was ready to call it a night. About an hour after I got home, it was around 6-something, my little sister called me. My sister, who I'll call Savannah, wanted me to take her and my nephew, who I'll call Jackson, trick-or-treating because neither our parents nor Jackson's parents felt like doing it. And as it usually goes, it fell on me to be the cool big brother to step in and make it happen. Savannah was 15 and Jackson was 11. Even though I wasn't feeling it at all, I got up, threw some clothes on, and headed to my parents' house to pick them up. Once I got there, I asked if they were ready, but Savannah was still finalizing her costume. She was dressed up as Raven from Teen Titans. She even had the white makeup on to give that ghostly appearance Raven usually has. Jackson was dressed as Sub-Zero from Mortal Kombat. Once Savannah was done, we got in the car and were on our way. I took them to a pretty busy neighborhood to make sure they got as much candy as possible. Upon arrival, we started going from house to house. Everyone we ran into was friendly and had plenty of treats to hand out. There was even one house where an older man gave them each a hot dog and a soda. He said every year for Halloween he doesn't hand out candy. He grills food instead because he'd rather give kids something with protein since it's good for the body. Honestly, we probably need more people like that. We passed a lot of other kids, and some gave compliments to Savannah and Jackson's costumes. I also saw some really cool costumes myself. Everyone in the area seemed to go all out. When we hit the last house for the night, we started walking back to the car. It was about a 10-minute walk since we had gone pretty far down the neighborhood. The neighborhood was less active now, and there weren't as many people out and about. That's why I got alarmed when I looked across the street and saw a person dressed in all black, standing in a yard where there were no porch lights on. I'm surprised I even noticed them at all, but I tend to always pay attention to my surroundings. When I looked closer, it seemed like the person was wearing a hooded cloak with an all-black outfit and a mask because I couldn't see their face at all. I honestly couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. Whoever it was, they appeared to be looking at us. I told Savannah and Jackson to stay close to me and said, "There's a suspicious person across the yard. Look, but don't stare." I said that so they could see who I was talking about without encouraging the person to approach or follow us. Jackson laughed and thought it was just someone trying to scare people walking by. Savannah, though, looked noticeably worried. Now, just to add some context, I was carrying a backpack with a Glock inside, and Savannah knew this, so when I told them to stay close, she probably realized I was being serious. Jackson was clueless. He's too young for me to tell him that I carry a real gun. As we were walking away, it looked like that person was still watching us, even though it was hard to tell in the dark. We were getting closer to the car when I suddenly heard heavy footsteps behind us, like boots hitting the concrete. I turned around and saw that same person again. Same outfit, all black, but this time I could see more clearly. They were wearing a tactical vest, tactical boots, and black pants tucked into the boots. They had on a full spandex mask that completely covered their face. That made the situation way more serious. When you see someone dressed like that, the first thing that comes to mind is that they're armed. He's following us, I thought. I whispered to Savannah and Jackson, "I need you both to listen very carefully. Do not stop walking and do not look back. The person I mentioned earlier is following us. They're behind us right now. The last thing we want is to alarm them or set them off, so just keep your composure and keep walking." I mainly looked at Jackson when saying this because he's younger and might not fully understand how serious this was. Savannah understood completely. We kept walking and did occasional glances behind us. The person stayed the same distance away, but was still following. When we got to the car, they were still coming our way. That's when I decided to make a bold move. I pulled out my Glock and pointed it at the person. I asked why they're following us. The person raised their hands, as if they didn't expect me to do that, then slowly removed their mask. It was a woman, and she looked to be in her 30s. She took her mask off but didn't answer my question. She just stared at me blankly. I asked again, still pointing the gun, "Why are you following us?" What she said next made no sense. In an almost robotic tone, she said, "I'm an undercover cop. I was told there was a break-in, so I came to check it out. That's why I was standing outside that house. But when you looked at me funny, I assumed you were the one who did it. So it would be wise to lower that weapon, or I could have you arrested for threatening an officer of the law." I hesitated, but then lowered my gun. What else was I supposed to do? I didn't want to risk an arrest or ruin the kid's night, but her story didn't make any sense. She claimed she got word of a break-in, so why would she just stand outside facing away from the house? How did me looking at her funny make her think I was the one who did it? Why would I break into a house and then casually walk through the neighborhood? And why was she wearing a hooded cloak? All these questions were racing through my mind, so I asked her, "If you're undercover, why are you in tactical gear? Wouldn't that kind of give away that you're law enforcement? And what's the point of the cloak?" She didn't answer. She just stared at me again, but this time her expression changed. There was something malicious in her eyes, like she was irritated that I didn't believe her and was deciding what to do next. Jackson and Savannah stayed completely quiet through all of this. Then she smiled this creepy, unsettling smile and said, "If you didn't have that gun, this night would have ended a hell of a lot different for you." Right as she finished saying that, I noticed 4 figures suddenly emerge from between the houses, walking toward us. All of them were wearing tactical gear, but without the cloak. I instantly told Savannah and Jackson to get in the car, keeping my eyes on the woman and the figures. Once I saw they were in, I got into and drove off. As I was leaving, the woman was still standing there smiling. The others, 3 men and 1 woman, were not smiling. They had blank, emotionless faces, like they didn't even have souls. It's hard to explain. The whole car ride back was silent. I'm sure the kids were in shock just like I was. I dropped them off, made sure they got in safely, then went home to process everything that happened. The thing I couldn't shake off was why they targeted us. The neighborhood was full of people walking around, so why us? I wish I could say it ended there, but it didn't. A few days later, I got a text from an unknown number. It was just a photo, no words. The picture was of my car, taken in the parking lot of my apartment complex. I contacted the police and told them everything that happened on Halloween night. They took the report, but they couldn't investigate unless a direct threat was made. Typical. Out of curiosity, and maybe stupidity, I went back to that same house where I first saw that woman. I knocked on the door, and a man in his 40s answered. I asked if they'd experienced a break-in on Halloween night. He looked confused and said no. He said he went to bed early because he had work the next morning and didn't notice anything strange. I told him what I saw, and he had no idea what I was talking about. I thanked him for his time and left. At that point, I already knew the undercover cop story was fake, but I wanted to do my own little investigation just to make sense of it. Whoever that woman and those people were somehow knew my phone number and where I lived. It makes me wonder, was that not a random encounter after all? Were they watching me for a while? Were they planning something that night, and my being armed threw them off? All those thoughts messed me up and made me feel paranoid for a long time. I had to go to therapy and install a Ring camera at my front door just to feel safe again. In case you're wondering, I haven't been contacted by any unknown numbers since. Nothing else has happened since that picture. 2 years later, I still think back on that night. Writing this out helps me a lot, and I'm trying to fully move on from it. But if there's one thing I want people to take away from this, it's to always watch your surroundings. You never know who might be watching you. It's easy to get caught up in something dangerous just for existing, so always stay safe and protected, because I can say with full confidence that being armed that night probably saved our lives.
When I was younger, my friends and I went trick-or-treating every year. This one particular year, as we were trick-or-treating, we passed a man who stood still with a mask on, holding a lantern. As we walked past him, he turned his whole body around and followed us with his eyes. We were creeped out, but there were plenty of people around, so we made our way to the next house. My friends and I saw him over and over again, as we made our way from house to house, and he seemed to be following us in typical horror story form. We walked so slow, we couldn't figure out how he kept up with us. At one house, when we hadn't seen him for a while, we got our candy. As we turned around to walk back to the street, the masked man stood in the road waiting for us. Immediately, we knocked back on the door and told the owners of the house about it. The masked man continued walking down the street, and we didn't see him again that night. Later on, an adult friend of the family told us he saw a masked man hiding behind a tree, waving little kids over, and he only backed off when he threatened to call the police.
I was trick-or-treating with my friend Casey. We were both 11 years old at the time. We were walking across a small wooden bridge over a small river that many called Jack Winkle River when a black Jeep pulled up on the other side of the bridge, basically blocking our way. We turned around and hurried away. We were the types of kids to obey the stranger danger rules. We could hear the windows of the Jeep rolling down, and a man with a raspy smoker's voice called for us to come back. He was yelling for help, asking us for directions. I yelled sorry, and we continued to hurry away. The Jeep couldn't fit over that small bridge, so it pulled away and drove down the road on the other side. We thought we had made our escape from the creepy driver, when here came an SUV barreling around the corner and down the street, slamming on the brakes in front of us. Once again, the driver rolled down the windows. Now with them right next to us, we could see there were 2 passengers in the car as well. An old guy with gray curly hair and a mustache in the backseat, who also had a raspy smoker's voice, told us to get in the car, that they have free bags of candy. The Jeep banged a 3-point turn and tailed us wherever we went. At one point, the Jeep finally accelerated past us, came to a stop, and the back and front passenger side doors opened, and the two creepy men stepped out lunging at us. We dropped our bags of candy and ran straight for my house, which was in sight now. We rang the doorbell desperately at least 20 times. The old men that were chasing us couldn't run fast, and when they saw us running to my house, they turned back. My mom opened the door and we screamed and pointed at the Jeep that was backing away in the other direction. She shoved us inside and locked the door and called the police like any mom would. She reported the black Jeep with 3 men inside, older looking, raspy voices, and any other descriptions we gave. My mom was freaking out all night, worried about the fact that they knew where we lived now. My dad tried to calm her, but she couldn't calm down. Ultimately, the police agreed to send an unmarked police car to stay out front and keep guard for 3 hours. That made my mom feel a little better, but what made us all feel better was when my dad woke us up to see the flashing red and blue lights outside of the unmarked police car. They had pulled over an SUV, a black Jeep, and 3 men were in cuffs. The 3 old creeps that tried to kidnap me and Casey. My dad went outside to talk to the officer and most likely confirmed that those were the men. Me and Casey went to the doorway and screamed at the men for their attention. They looked, and we both gave them the finger. My mom then pulled us back in and shut the door, sending us to bed. It went from the worst night of both of our lives to ultimately the best night of our lives.